Right, sorry everyone, I was on mute. Am I coming through on all platforms? I would love to get a few messages in the chat from X, from YouTube, and from Substack. If one of them is not working, I'm just going to let it go for now. I'm trying to broadcast on all three. Haven't done this before. So just while I wait to see, oh yeah, evening all, says son of Gillian. That's nice. Hello. 21 people watch on YouTube. All right, cool. Well, we're going out on at least one platform, so that's good. And yeah, before I start the main topic, I'll just give people a little time to come through. I'll just explain. Right, I'm using a new. I used to use StreamYard. Not that I used to stream that much anyway, but I used to use StreamYard. Now I'm using Restream, so I had to learn everything again. And for anyone who's new to me, I used to have a YouTube channel. I did a few videos in 2016. Nobody watched them. Tried again in 2019, and some generous people like Morgoth and Millennial Woes helped me get seen. And yeah, I had a YouTube channel back then, which it was banned in 2020 around the start of the lockdowns. And I heard that a few people were appealing and getting their channels back, and I appealed and I got the channel back very quickly as well. They replied within less than an hour, and I think they said sorry. Sorry, we didn't mean to delete your channel. I don't know what that's all about. They did mean to, of course, but I've got it back. So just giving this a try. Basically, we're going to talk about the Focus, also known as the Anti-Nazi Council. That is the topic. So I'll make a start, right? If you've heard of the Focus, very likely it's from David Irving. Oh, I should just say at this point, if anybody leaves questions or anything, just please repeat them later on. There'll be a question section. I'm going to do my oration first. I can't concentrate on both at the same time. But yeah, I've got a certain thing prepared that I want to talk about. So it's sort of notes, sort of half written, just experimental. If you've heard of the Focus before, it's probably from one of a few people. Almost everybody would have heard of them, this group, the Anti-Nazi Council, which Churchill renamed to the Focus. They would have heard it from David Irving, usually. There's a certain 2-minute clip that's gone around millions and millions of views that I've seen, where Irving says that Churchill was bought. There's a longer lecture that's from when Irving was doing a world tour. I believe it would have been in the 80s. It looks like the 80s, maybe the 90s. But I think he wrote his book, Churchill's War, in the 80s, and then did a newer version in the 2000s. And that was the book where he talks about, Churchill's activities. In the first volume, it's just all the time before the war started. And that's what I'm talking about here. So this is going to be concerning the 1930s. And sorry, I've got to clear my throat. The longer Irving lecture that I referred to, that famous clip comes from, that's got some tens of thousands of views on YouTube. I'm sure it had many more before it was probably banned the first time around. But the latest version of it that's been up for like 4 years, it's on YouTube. It's got about 60-odd thousand views. I will recommend watching it. But my point here is to expand on Irving, because Irving didn't cover everything that there is actually to say. No disparagement of him implied. I wouldn't know about any of this if it wasn't for Irving, and I've written several essays based on his work. He's sort of the bedrock here. But if you've heard of the Focus, it's usually from Irving. There's several other sources that I'm going to draw from, though. Firstly, I'll mention the one that he draws from, which is Robert Henriquez. Robert Henriquez is definitely a trustworthy source on this, as I'll come back to later. But he's a little-known historian. He was also a military officer and a member of the famous Henriquez family of, I believe, Sephardic origin. There's 3 other historians so basically, like last year, I just decided I wanted to make an essay out of, because I was unsatisfied that there's just a 2-minute video clip going around. I wanted to make a fuller essay of it and to really like emphasize the solidity of this evidence, right? Because David Irving's like a much disparaged man. I mean, many of us admire him. I would say, he's flawed, like any historian's flawed. But he researches things that others just don't go into, and he does research to a standard that others don't bother. He talks about it himself. What's the point in listening to conformist, derivative historians? They just tell you what you've already read elsewhere. Irving's the opposite of that. He reads through the whole archives. He goes to people's diaries. He does interviews with people who others can't get access to. He's done all sorts of things. He learned, fluent German, so and he won the trust of loads of German officers who wouldn't talk to other anti-fascist historians and so on. So Irving's immensely important, but since he lost that libel case in the 90s against Deborah Lipstadt, who had called him a Holocaust denier, he's widely described by his enemies as discredited, as disgraced David Irving and so on, which is daft. He just lost a defamation trial, which it was a mistake to launch, probably. I don't know. And there was a biased judge. I don't know. I'm not going to comment too much on that. But on the matter of Churchill's life, I haven't seen anybody I haven't seen anybody substantially dispute his claims. If they could disprove what he says about the focus, they certainly would have. Richard Evans, the famous sort of antagonist of Irving, and a whole team of others with, I think, limitless resources, effectively, combed over Irving's whole career. Ron Unz pointed this out in an essay on David Irving, that his whole career has been combed over in great detail, trying to find ways to discredit him. And they came up with a book's worth of stuff, but none of it's very important. It does show that he's flawed, but, again, he has virtues that no one else has. So I mentioned Robert Henriquez. He is the source that Irving quotes mainly on this, but there have been others since. As I say, these are from Henriquez is writing in the 60s, Irving writing in the 80s. 3 other historians I come across who are more recent, who I'd not heard of apart from in connection to this, were Richard Hawkins, Daniel Tillis, and Zbigniew Vidra, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Czech historian. I don't know these guys. I assume they're all left-wing. They all seem approving of the subject they're talking about, which is, the focus and broader sort of Jewish strategies of, well, they say self-defense, but it's also about affecting British foreign policy and American foreign policy. But yeah, those 3 writers have covered that, and it's very useful because they corroborate Irving and expand on it, and they tie it in with other things, which is what I've been trying to do with the essay that I mentioned. That essay is called Champions of Judea, and the idea with that, I started off just wanting to write a few paragraphs about the focus, just to say this isn't, like what's just said about Irving. This is not just some ranting Nazi sympathizer making this stuff up. It's true, and it's corroborated, but it also ties in with a much broader history, which you'll get some idea of now, right, when I talk about all this. Another source is Richard Cockett, again, very much very much pro-Churchill, anti-Hitler, anti-Chamberlain, strongly anti-Neville Chamberlain. I can't remember the name of his book, but it's a book about how Chamberlain, he accuses Chamberlain of scheming to preserve peace, basically. He wouldn't put it in those words, but Richard Cockett. He's a writer for The Economist, and they're no friends of nation states. John Charmley is another source, but John Charmley just refers to Irving. His treatment of it is quite unusual. He sort of apologizes for using Irving, but there's no need to. It's only because this cloud of controversy has been created to sort of follow Irving's name around. But John Charmley is a historian I've benefited from a great deal. I'd say he's like a revisionist, a mainstream revisionist, you could say. Another one is Roy Jenkins, who is definitely left wing. No question of Nazi sympathies there, and he has a couple of pages about the focus in his biography of Winston Churchill, which came out after Irving's book. And the last source that I'll name is David Locke. Again, wrote later than Jenkins. His book is called No More Champagne, and it's about Churchill's money matters, and it's a very pertinent book for what I'm talking about here, because I don't claim to be able to fully explain Churchill's motives and why he did what he did, why he took the stances that he did. Obviously, it amounted to a pro-Soviet stance. That needs some explaining because he was an anti-Soviet guy, a genuine anti-communist. When you look at his money affairs, it begins to make sense, a lot more sense. So when Irving said, sort of summarily in his short video, Churchill was bought, David Locke, spelt Luff, like Loughborough, but David Locke, it's very much mainstream, seems to be at pains to praise Churchill and exculpate him for anything he did, without saying he was perfect. He was saying he was bad with money. But I think if you read that book, you see just how important money was. Locke said himself in a speech that I watched about this book when it came out about 10 years ago, that Churchill was, and this many others have agreed on this, Churchill was ready to leave politics, and it was the bailouts he got specifically from Henry Strakosch in 38 and 40 that kept him in politics. He would have had to leave and just do something else because politics didn't make much money. But we'll come to Henry Strakosch later. The reason I'm not making it all about Henry Strakosch, who a lot of people will have heard of, is because that is actually later chronologically. The focus was already well underway for 2 years before he came on the scene. Although he was on the scene in another way, which is not much mentioned. That comes later. So if you know of any other sources, anybody who talks about the Focus or the Anti-Nazi Council, the same group of people, I'm going to call it the Focus from now on. If you know of any other sources, do tell me. Put it in the comments, please. Because I've tried to read everything about these guys and what they were up to and how it should really be understood. And yeah, I might as well try and stay on top of the whole field. It's a small field, so it's okay. So I'll tell you a bit about the context of, I guess, what we should call like anti-Hitler campaigning, anti-Nazi campaigning in Britain before the Focus, right? The Focus, Churchill joined it in, I think, May of 1936. Before that, it was called the Anti-Nazi Council, and it was the British branch of a worldwide movement of a much longer name, the World Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi Council for Human Rights. I'm not saying that again. Started by Samuel Untermyer, an extremely wealthy and sort of ethnic activist Jewish lawyer from, I think, New York, from USA anyway. Untermyer sounds like a German name, so I guess he was of German Jewish ancestry. His aim, quite plainly and stated in quite aggressive terms, was to force Hitler out of power. This boycott that he started was the first leg of that. Obviously, he did not, in fact, limit himself to that, but it was an effort to recruit much of the public and to gain publicity and to begin sort of driving a wedge diplomatically between other countries and the US and Germany and Hitler's Germany. So simultaneously and spontaneously, I believe, Jewish immigrants in the East End of London, who are of, more sort of Russian Empire ancestry. If you want to read more about that, you could see my essay "Ties Abroad" on Substack. They also started a boycott of Germany. Either they had the same idea, or they were talking to Untermyer, or it's just an idea that arose among Jews in general. But as to both of these, anyway, starting a boycott, of as Jews saying, we're not going to buy your stuff anymore, we're not going to buy German exports. Okay, that's only going to have a limited impact, right? Because Jews, they're a small minority of the population in Britain or Germany or America at that time. 1% roughly in Britain at the time. So they need to do a lot more than just withdraw their buying power. They need, if this is the aim they've decided on, which is basically to force Hitler out of power, they need whole countries to join the boycott, or they need whole countries to go to further measures than that. So Vidra, the Czech historian who I mentioned, he remarks that, this is a quote, "The Jewish boycott of Germany was an international activity. and can be seen, and can be understood as a type of Jewish foreign policy. And he also says the main goal was terminating Jewish persecution by overthrowing Hitler, and the boycott was meant to be one of the means of bringing Germany down on its knees. In Samuel Untermeyer's words, the aim of his, quote, purely defensive economic boycott was to, quote, undermine the Hitler regime and bring the German people to their senses by destroying their export trade on which their very existence depends. Their very existence was in his hands, he thought. So it's aimed at the people. It's to immiserize the people and to force them to overthrow Hitler out of sheer despair. As I say, this alone, I doubt he expected to achieve that, but this in combination with other things, maybe. So many people would be familiar with the Daily Express headline from 1933, I think it was. Judea declares war on Hitler. It referred to this. Above all else, it referred to this. Beaverbrook was aware, Untermeyer had plenty of publicity, wanted publicity. Beaverbrook was aware of this. Lord Beaverbrook was the owner of the Express. And as with the Daily Mail now, as with some tabloids, the journalist is expected to write what the editor wants. So the editorials in the paper are not the editor, the owner. Maybe the editor too. Maybe the editor is just a cipher for the owner. But Lord Beaverbrook was sort of the chief writer of his own paper as well. Anyway, Judea declares war on Germany, declares war on Hitler. Referred to this, right? There's now an organized effort on the part of whatever he referred to by Judea to declare, to destroy Hitler, to force him out of power. So, regime change, right? Now, in one of my essays, I put it like this. At least as early as May 1933, while Soviet collectivization killed millions, Untermeyer declared that Hitler's government was carrying out a, quote, cruel campaign of extermination, unquote, in 1933. His accusations were repeated in private correspondence as well as in speeches, newspaper articles, and open letters. He specified in 1934 that not mere expulsion from Germany, but the death of all Jews, quote, by murder, suicide, or starvation, was Hitler's, quote, openly avowed official policy and boasted purpose, which I think is a little early, a little overeager. To the suggestion of verifying whereof he spoke, Untermeyer replied, quote, I have no intention of going to see Hitler, although asked by his friends to do so. Churchill similarly spoke only about Hitler, never to him. Untermeyer, though, happily visited the Soviet Union during the Great Terror. Churchill did so in secret during the war. So I find that interesting that they only ever wanted to talk about him, never to him. We'll return to that theme later. Richard Hawkins, who, as I said, I assume is a left-wing historian, he says, quote, the activities of the Anti-Nazi Council, he means the broader one, appear to have gone he means the British branch. The activities of the Anti-Nazi Council in Britain appear to have gone largely unreported, apart from a successful demonstration of as many as 20,000 and a meeting in London's Hyde Park, joined by many thousands more, on October 27th, 1935. It was addressed by prominent British politicians and academics from across the political spectrum. Not actually from across the political spectrum, they're all leftists, but including Eleanor Rathbone MP, a Liberal and then an Independent. Clement Attlee obviously went on to become Labour Prime Minister, Labour leader and Labour Prime Minister in the after Churchill. Walter Citrine, the head of the Trade Union Congress. Professor J.B.S. Haldane, you may have heard of Haldane, the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. Keir Starmer was or is one of them. And Sylvia Pankhurst, the famous suffragette and I think a communist sympathiser as well. And that demo in Hyde Park, 20,000 people, I don't know whether that was large for the time, but that was broadcast on the BBC. So the BBC were just broadly favourable. I don't know if they were exactly promoting it. They used to broadcast from all sorts of things, but I would note that they did not broadcast from any, for instance, meetings of the British Union of Fascists, or as far as I know, any other anti-war pro-peace organisations, which you may oppose the BUF, but they were against war with Germany, and I don't think they were campaigning for war with anyone else. But these demos were, as I say, the strategy was to bring Germany down on its knees, as Vidra says. Just making sure we're coming through. Yes. There's a few comments in the chat. That will do for now. So, Churchill, before he joined the Focus, I speculate that he was in contact with Untermeyer, maybe at one remove. He was already a good friend of, say, Bernard Baruch. Baruch may well have known Untermeyer. That's one of many links, many potential links. But Churchill, from within, I think, days or a few weeks of Hitler coming to power, obviously before anything like the Anschluss, long before that, long before the Kristallnacht or remilitarizing anything that's cited as proof that Hitler wanted war and mass murder. Long before that, Churchill, along with Judea, so to speak, was immediately castigating Hitler in Parliament, in speeches, in articles. And in 1934, Churchill was given a BBC spot. There was BBC Talks was a regular program several times a week, I think. Always left-leaning, always communist sympathising. I've written an essay about that if you want to read. It's called The Engine of Compulsory Conformity. It's on my Substack. The BBC in the 20s and 30s. It was already, like, people say the BBC's gone woke or whatever. When do you think that happened? Do you think that happened since Blair or something? No. The BBC was founded by Reds, I'm afraid. It's more complicated than that. Reds is probably not the right term, but leftists, subversives, traitors. BBC gave Winston Churchill time to do a spot, a half-hour spot or whatever, to make a speech that included this. Quote, "When we look out upon the state of Europe and of the world and of the position of our own country as they are tonight, it seems to me that the next year or the next 2 years may contain a fateful turning point in our history. I'm afraid if you look intently at what is moving towards Great Britain, you will see that the only choice open is the old grim choice our forebears had to face, namely, whether we shall submit or whether we shall prepare, whether we shall submit to the will of a stronger nation or whether we shall prepare to defend our rights, liberties, and indeed our lives. If we submit, our submission should be timely. If we prepare, our preparation should not be too late. Submission would entail, at the very least, the passing and destruction of the British Empire, and the acceptance by our people within and under a Teutonic domination of Europe." What's he referring to? Their army of less than 100,000 men that's confined to it. So he'd already decided in 1934, before they violated the Versailles Pacts or anything, the Versailles treaties, before they'd done anything wrong, just based on stuff Hitler has said, I guess, that Britain was under the, and needed to prevent this within the next year or two, by 1936, was under the looming threat of Teutonic domination of Europe. Bear in mind just the size of the armed forces of France, let alone everyone else put together, all the other countries surrounding Germany. Never mind that. Teutonic domination is coming. So what was the focus? Well, before Hitler joined, it was a continuation of the Anti-Nazi Council, i.e. the people I named before, people like Eleanor Rathbone, Clement Attlee, Walter Citrine. That's a big figure, the head of the Trade Union Congress. He's got influence over millions of workers. And all these, leftish people. It was, left-wingers who were concerned with the rise of Hitler, probably because it was a great obstacle to the rise of Marxism. I mean, why else? What had he done? What had the Nazis done by this point? So those sorts, the initial effort, the initial rallies at which the anti-Nazi council assembled. It became a dinner club. Generally, obviously, rich people, MPs, mostly MPs, and media figures and so on, which I'll come to, who attended. A wealthy Jewish immigrant out of Germany called Eugen Speer, as in Eugene, Eugen Speer. He covered the costs of this dinner club. He wasn't mega rich. We'll come to where the big money comes from later, but he was the original money. And Eugen Speer went on to write the book about the Focus, which you can read online right now for free. And we'll come back to that. Reginald Leeper, who was a senior Foreign Office civil servant, who was not at the very top, but second or third rank, very high up, he introduced Winston Churchill to the dinner club in April of 1936. I'm surprised if Churchill hadn't heard about it, but a meeting with Leeper at Churchill's home, Chartwell, great mansion, convinced Churchill to start attending these dinners. I just want to emphasise, Reginald Leeper was a civil servant, scheming in the background to affect his own country's foreign policy. Now, Churchill started attending these dinners, and as the most famous man there, a man who liked to talk a lot, a man with a forceful personality, a lot of ambition and oratorical skills, a famous writer and journalist, he seems to have thrust himself into the leading position. He became the figurehead, at least, of the Focus. And he formalised it into a campaigning group, said, let's meet regularly, let's have events, let's make something out of this. He formalised it into a campaigning group. The longer name was the Focus in Defence of Peace and Freedom. Roy Jenkins calls it the Focus Group, capital F, capital G. That's a bit confusing because focus groups has another meaning now. But I think it's weird to call it the Focus. Who uses focus as a noun? That's a verb, right? But yeah, anyway, that is what he chose. Now, it wasn't just about the Nazis, strangely. At least if you trust this passage from Roy Jenkins. It's a fairly long passage, but I think this colours in the picture. Because Churchill was not simply an anti-fascist or whatever we should call him in his capacity as the great nemesis of Adolf Hitler, which, as I say, he was from the moment Hitler got into power. He wasn't just that. He was a guy trying to become prime minister, which he had dreamt of all his life. One quote, it's maybe a bit trite, but I think it says something about his character. He remarked to someone decades before this, everyone is a worm, but I'm a glowworm. It's like, yeah, we're all... he thought of himself as special. And he was ambitious, and, he had some of the talents that it takes to become a politician. I wouldn't say a good politician, but he had some personal magnetism, and he had ambition and drive. He was not lazy. He was quite smart. I'd say his judgment was dreadful, but he had a certain kind of intelligence. He had a way with words. Some people just liked him. Neville Chamberlain liked him, I think. Even people he was a real problem for. He was quite likable, a fun character, enjoyable, good to get pissed with, probably. Anyway, Roy Jenkins says, Churchill's 1936 move towards the centre of British politics, interesting, was a neat exercise, strategically wise and tactically well executed. It was achieved through a number of relatively minor organisations with confusing names, which were made in sum into a considerable force, mainly through the refulgence of Churchill's fame and personality. That is to say, this was a vehicle for him. He was trying to get back into politics. He was in his wilderness phase, This was potentially a vehicle for him. And it was this quality, combined with his oratory, which made him such a desirable catch for those by whom he had recently decided that he wanted to be caught. So it's sort of a mutual interest thing. Central to the enterprise was the so-called focus group. This began hesitantly as a luncheon club meeting in the Hotel Victoria on the corner of Northumberland Avenue, and only a few. There was some early doubt about who was to pay the bills for the repasts. This was quickly and satisfactorily resolved, mainly through the generosity of Eugen Speer, a rich German Jew, who was not exactly a refugee, for he had migrated to Britain as early as 1922. This length of residence did not prevent his being interned as an enemy alien in June 1940. Blah blah blah. He returned to Britain in 1945 and subsequently published some interesting insights into the focus group. What Jenkins doesn't mention there is that he published those insights after Churchill died, at Churchill's request. Churchill did not want people to talk about this. One of these insights was that Churchill at the luncheons always insisted on sitting next to Lady Violet Bonham Carter, who was a regular participant, and also on having his favourite port served. There was a special warmth between those two. This regaining of centre stage by Lady Violet was a good indication of a mild leftward movement on Churchill's part, although from this point of view there was one even more significant focus participant, and that was Sir Walter Citrine, General Secretary of the TUC, Trade Union Congress. Others closely associated with the group, I'm going to come back to some of these names. Others closely associated were Henry Wickham Steed, a former editor of the Times, Norman Angell, a leading peace propagandist. I'm skipping over some bits here. He had briefly been a Labour MP. He'd won the Nobel Peace Prize. Philip Guedala, a historian. Duncan Sands, son-in-law of Churchill. Less core figures were Archibald Sinclair, who was the leader of the Liberal Party, and two Labour MPs, Philip Noel Baker and Hugh Dalton. Hugh Dalton in particular is worth talking about. I'll come back to him. Towards the end of the year, Clement Attlee, the party leader who was always cautious, he was persuaded by Lord Cecil of Chelwood to sign a League of Nations Union manifesto, of which Churchill was the principal author. Lord Cecil was definitely worth mentioning. He was the son, I believe, of the Marquis of Salisbury, who had been Prime Minister several times, Lord Salisbury. He was his son, but very different. Churchill, indeed, during this year of repositioning, operated through a series of fronts which in their cumulative effectiveness were reminiscent of the contemporary efforts of his sworn enemies, the British Communist Party. Thus, the focus group evolved into the Anti-Nazi Council. That's wrong, it's the other way around. With Citrine as president, and Norman Angell, Sylvia Pankhurst of suffragette fame, and Eleanor Rathbone, the much respected and left-leaning as vice presidents. But Churchill was very much the guiding spirit, as he was also of the British section of the New Commonwealth Society, of which Lord Davies, a rich public-spirited Welsh peer, persuaded him to accept the presidency. I think seems like a side issue, but it ties in, right? In June 1936, Davies wrote long and flattering, heartfelt letters to Churchill, urging him to use that New Commonwealth Society as a platform and to become himself the light of the world and to save Europe from disaster. This is all in response to Hitler specifically, not Stalin, not Marxism, anything. It's all about Germany. Churchill responded with an enthusiasm which was only slightly wary. He was indeed very good in this phase at ecumenicism, i.e. working with anyone regardless of party lines and so on. He wrote to Lord Cecil in October, when yet another body called Freedom and Peace was mooted, another front group, saying there's no question of eclipsing the New Commonwealth Society nor the League of Nations Union, which he also supported, but only for a fusion of practical working effort and for united advance. So you see, these are all different names of groups, but mostly the same people, mostly the same concern. They supported the League of Nations because they thought that was a good vehicle against Germany. They supported the New Commonwealth Society for similar reasons, I guess to unite the Commonwealth forces or something. I don't know. But also peace and freedom, freedom and peace, defense of peace and freedom. And there was other names they used as well. A later one was the League and the Covenant. as in, again, promoting the League of Nations and its covenant. But yeah, basically Churchill is saying all these different groups, I've got the same intention. I support them all for similar reasons. And there's more I'm skipping through, but on the 25th of November, Churchill further fortified his position by a rousing speech to a new Commonwealth Society London hotel luncheon, which attracted the splendid audience of 450 people, and everything seemed en bonne voie for an Albert Hall umbrella rally, bringing all the interlocking organisations together. This had been under consideration since the beginning of the focus group, but Churchill had been reluctant to hold it prematurely. Now, with confidence, i.e. with all these sort of quite diverse allies all coming together, it was to take place in December of 36, and Walter Citrine was to take the chair. So, yeah, it was to symbolise the new unity of the anti-Nazi and pro-collective security political centre, Jenkins says. So I'm sorry for the long quote, but the point there is that I think you need to hear that just to understand that Churchill sort of needed to excuse himself for working with the left. He was thought of as, I mean, he really was an anti-communist in the, from the time the Bolsheviks took over in 1917, up until Hitler appeared, up until Hitler became Chancellor. Then it all began to switch, but he couldn't just switch without saying anything. But under these sort of ecumenical sounding principles, like collective security or the covenant of the League of Nations, he could do it. He had an excuse, as it were, an excuse to the people to his right, I guess, and to the right wing of the press. People who would criticise him for working with all these leftists, and they were leftists. This was a way to do that. It was a way to basically switch sides while saying that he hadn't done so. And about that new Commonwealth Society, it sounds very peaceful and pleasant, but on the Wikipedia page for it says, in a speech to it in May 1937, Churchill said, quote, "We are one of the few peace societies that advocates the use of force, if possible, overwhelming force, to support public international law." Apart from the sort of threatening, bellicose statement, public international law. International law just means the League of Nations. There was no other. Well, there was the Geneva Conventions. Churchill definitely did not support the Geneva Conventions, as we can see from his behaviour in the Second World War and the behaviour of his ally Stalin, who I think explicitly repudiated the Geneva Conventions. Anyway, this was cant, right? This stuff about supporting international law, that was nonsense, absolute twaddle. Anyway, in June of 1937, Eugen Speer said to Churchill, "It is one of the objects of the Focus to provide its members, and you most of all, with just those facilities which a party machine provides: publicity by public meetings, through the press and our publications. The Focus is steadily growing. Its audiences daily become larger, its backing ever more forceful, with the support of some of the most important people in the country." Richard Hawkins says, "The Focus helped revive Churchill's political career. As Eugen Speer later observed, quote, later on, it was easy to forget the part the Focus played in creating a platform for Winston Churchill at a time he was in the political wilderness. They saw him as their champion. That's how I characterise it. Hence my essay being called Champions of Judea. He was identified as someone who should be hired." I haven't come yet to the money question behind it, but this is, he was seen as a very able and effective champion for this cause. And what was that cause? Bringing down Hitler specifically, not Marxism, not even Mussolini or Franco or anything. Not even fascism broadly. It was about Hitler and Germany, right? I wrote in one of my essays, quote, Eugen Speer, a Jewish immigrant from Germany and one of the founders and main funders, wrote a book on the career of the organisation, but did not have it published until 1963. Irving says that, quote, Churchill pleaded with Speer not to publish it during his lifetime. Pleaded with him. That might be a bit of Irving colour there, a bit of flavour, but yeah, Churchill wanted this kept secret, and the focus itself was secret. The meetings were secret. There's no, minute. Oh, there might have been minutes kept actually, but they were secret as well. Yeah, the focus itself, the core group behind all these front groups, was supposed to be secret. I hope it comes across why I read out that long section from Roy Jenkins. It's really what was happening was that, and Eugen Speer, obviously, and others were conscious of this, that this was a vehicle for Churchill to get into power so that he could take over the government and absolutely reverse British foreign policy, which under Stanley Baldwin and for Neville Chamberlain, who were the prime ministers from... Stanley Baldwin came in 35, I think, not his first spell, 34 or 35. And then it was Chamberlain until 1940 when Churchill became prime minister. That was, after the Dunkirk evacuation. Under Baldwin and Chamberlain, you weren't going to get war. You were going to get rearmament. It's a myth that they didn't rearm. They absolutely did, especially Chamberlain. But they were not rearming to the extent that Churchill and his buddies, what I'm going to call the war party, wanted. They wanted all-out hostility. These people wanted all-out hostility to Germany. And as I say, regime change. They said so themselves. Bring Germany to its knees. Churchill saw this, by the way, as a Jewish organisation. Quoting Irving, that Churchill wryly recognised who was behind this body. The basis of the Anti-Nazi League, he would write later in 36 to his later in the year of 36 to his son Randolph Churchill, misquoting its proper title, calling it the League instead of the Council, is of course Jewish resentment at their abominable persecution. But as I've pointed out, obviously the Jews involved in the focus were in Britain, and they were not persecuted. Far from it. They had a lot of politicians choosing to support them. They already had meetings with ministers, which I'll come to later. Just on the basis of being Jews, just as a leading figure in the Jewish community, various Jews could get meetings with Home Secretary, with senior civil servants as well. They were the opposite of persecuted. They were listened to. They were treated as a respectable lobby that should be heard. But the resentment bit that Churchill mentioned, that was true. They resented that any anti-Jewish regime could exist, right? And Hitler's regime obviously was quite focused on overthrowing what they saw as Jewish power and Jewish subversion in their country. In that sense, it was an anti-Jewish regime. And so the resentment of the existence of that regime was the key motivation. We cannot stand that to exist. We can stand the Soviet Union. We can stand all sorts of foul governments. But if you go against Jews, that was a different matter. I think it's safe to say that people like Eugen Speer and the other Jews who were involved in this, who I'm going to describe, they were conducting, as Zbigniew Vidra says, a Jewish foreign policy. But obviously they weren't a state themselves. They did not possess a state. So what does it really mean to pursue a Jewish foreign policy? In their case, it meant to supplant British foreign policy, right? How else? What else could they do in Britain? What else were they campaigning for? It was to say, your foreign policy is not good for our people over in Germany and anywhere else that Germany might take over. And we're not having that. So you Brits, you need to stop caring about your own interests, and you need to stop having a country, basically. We have a foreign policy and you need to adopt it. So the focus, I think, just to put it in one sentence, it was a campaign group for regime change in Germany, which entailed regime change in Britain as well. Chamberlain was not going to do what they wanted. Chamberlain was very suspicious of them. Chamberlain later put Churchill and others under surveillance, and wrote various letters and diary entries talking about all these scoundrelous things that Churchill was doing. which comes later. But yeah, this was a regime change operation. And as I say, as Britain, unless it was forced, the British nation state was not going to do what they wanted, so they had to take it over. I think the moment that symbolised the regime change and immediately preceded Churchill taking over was when Leo Amery, who supported the Focus, was certainly in the same camp. I don't know whether he attended their dinners. He shouted out in Parliament after the Norway debacle in 1940, "In the name of God, man, go." I think he was quoting Oliver Cromwell. He shouted that out to Neville Chamberlain, and Neville Chamberlain did indeed resign shortly after. But it's quoted, sort of gloatingly by historians, as in it was like when Chamberlain finally couldn't hide his own inadequacy. There's such a perversion of the truth. Chamberlain wasn't even at fault for the Norway campaign, let alone everything else. Chamberlain was trying to keep the peace. Anyway, the bit that perhaps is most, I don't know, it's most that many historians are most eager to ignore and deny, and that most historians have ignored because it can't be denied, is that there was a secret fund of money that hove into view. Well, it stayed in the background, didn't heave into view, but came into effect to back the Focus, right? So the Focus, the only money behind it at first was the fact that people who attended it were fairly wealthy, and that Eugen Speer paid for their dinners and paid for the rooms and so on, maybe paid for their tube tickets. But he wasn't mega rich. But then we learn from Robert Henriquez, who was himself, a Sephardic Jew, I believe, and is a member of the Henriquez family, which was one of the families of the so-called Anglo-Jewish cousinhood. If you've read Andrew Joyce essays, you'll know about this. That's where I learned about it. He is drawing on the book The Cousinhood by Chaim Bermant, which I haven't read myself yet, but I'm pretty sure that there were 7 families. The Rothschilds were one. I think the Cohens were another, as in Sacha Baron Cohen. I think he might be descended of that family. I could be wrong. There's a lot of people called Cohen. I think the Sassoons may have been included. I'm not sure. They came from Iraq. They may have arrived later. Goldschmidt, I think, was one of the families. Mokata, which is a very European-sounding name. Gold brokers, bullion brokers, I think. Very rich. And Henriquez was another one of these families. Most of these families were involved in finance, gold brokerage, bullion, shipping bullion. The Rothschilds specialized in financing states, but a lot of things. Anyway, Robert Henriquez, in his book called Sir Robert Whaley Cohen, it's a book about the man of that name, obviously, a biography. This is the source that Irving primarily draws upon. Henriquez describes how leaders of Anglo Jewry, that's his term, met at New Court every week. New Court was the business premises, the main central business premises of the Rothschilds' banking interests in Britain. And that was the mainstay of the Rothschild banking interests worldwide, at least at that time. When the 5 Rothschild brothers were sent out from Frankfurt originally in the late 1700s, they went to London, Manchester first, Nathan Rothschild, and his 4 brothers went to, I believe, Napoli, Vienna, Paris, and one of them stayed in Frankfurt, I think. But the Manchester and then London branch became the most successful, I guess, just because the British Empire was so important. And Nathan Rothschild, the sort of the first generation kingpin, he was the richest man in the world at the time that he died. New Court was their premises in London, still is, I think. NM Rothschild Company, I think that still operates out of there. There's also a residence, I believe. Anyway, weekly, at least at that time, I don't know how far back these meetings went, but there were meetings of leaders of Anglo Jewry I would imagine Robert Henriquez himself, the guy writing about this, or his father Basil, who was famous. I don't know if he was still alive, but I imagine one of the Henriquez's. I imagine this is a first-hand account, but he doesn't put himself in the story. But at those meetings, one of the major figures was Robert Whaley Cohen, and he was, among many other things, the vice president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. The Board of Deputies, there's I mentioned these three historians earlier, Hawkins, Tillis, and Vidra. They're good. Reading their essays is good for just a broader picture of what the Board of Deputies was doing, i.e. trying to organise, what they call Jewish self-defence through the 30s. Robert Whaley Cohen was a leading figure in the BOD. And Henriquez says, quote, "It was decided at Newcourt to raise a secret fund, initially of £50,000, which would work with the sympathetic non-Jewish organisations as well as with the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the latter providing the hard facts of Nazi atrocities which were so seldom reported in the press." £50,000. Irving emphasises how much money that was. That's, I think, tens of millions now, definitely millions. You can't trust inflation adjustments. They're always based on the consumer price index, but that is not a genuine picture of. That's just tracking the prices of certain goods. That doesn't. Obviously, it can't track how people adjust their habits to accommodate rising prices, as in people trade down in some cases, or people just buy less. They keep buying the expensive stuff, but less units of it. None of that is accounted for in CPI figures, right? So whatever, if you do a CPI adjustment now, 50,000, it will say, I don't know, 2 million or something. You can multiply that many times more. I don't know how much, because there is no way of tracking inflation for real. But we're talking millions, I think tens of millions of pounds. Anyway, let's say millions. And Henriquez mentions that the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which was going to work with this secret fund, with Anglo Jewry, with the establishment of Jewry in Britain, the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, would, as he said, provide the hard facts of Nazi atrocities, which were so seldom reported in the press. Remember, this is in 1936, 2 years before the Night of Broken Glass. What atrocities were they referring to? There was concentration camps. They were established immediately after Hitler came to power. They were for concentrating dangerous subversives, violent revolutionaries, communists, right? The Communist Party was a huge organization in Germany. They had a paramilitary wing called Antifa, Anti-Fascist Action. Openly, it may have been illegal, I don't know, but it was operating. The Social Democrat Party, also Marxist in origin, it was more complicated than that, but they also had a paramilitary wing, right? This is why Hitler's party had the stormtroopers. You needed a paramilitary wing to survive, to have meetings, to have events, to have a headquarters. The concentration camps, at least until the war, were for concentrating dangerous enemies. There was also a prison system. If you were a criminal, you were sent to prisons. Concentration camps were for political prisoners, right? By and large, I'm sure there were some arbitrary arrests, some unfair, unjust arrests, but these were largely enemies of the state, obviously of the new state, not of the intended communist state. And they were probably Anyway, what atrocities? What are they referring to in 1936? There was not this program of murder. There was not, Einsatzgruppen or anything like that. There was no murder camps. Anyway, according to the Forward, the Jewish magazine, the American Jewish magazine, the Forward, in 2018, reviewing a book called Bureau of Spies by Stephen Usdin, quote, JTA's Austrian-born founder, Jacob Landau, struck a deal with British intelligence by which the publication provided press credentials to British spies and promulgated made-up stories in exchange for funding. That deal was made in 1940, by the way, but I mention it as an indication of what the Jewish Telegraphic Agency did, what the Board of Deputies and the New Court, I'll say the New Court group, what they were working with. They were working with a group that would, in the words of Jewish magazines, Jewish historians, promulgated made-up stories in exchange for funding. So you begin to get an idea of what the leaders of Anglo Jewry at New Court intended the focus to be. It was a propaganda body, right? It was a disinfo body in some ways. It was like their own black ops. What do you call it? Black propaganda group. Robert Henriquez says, this is his words, there was a need, quote, to find a platform which would enlist the wholehearted support of the greatest possible number of Gentile friends. So specifically about recruiting a bodyguard of Gentiles to advance the Jewish cause. Henriquez says again, quote, Bob, that's Robert Whaley Cohen. I didn't finish mentioning who he was, did I? Whaley Cohen was also the managing director of Shell in Britain. Shell was an Anglo-Dutch company. The overall chief of it was Henry Dieterding for a long time, but Robert Whaley Cohen became a very rich man, very rich, by being the number 2, the British number 1 of Shell, the oil company, the oil and transport company, oil and oil transport, Royal Dutch Shell. Bob, says Henriquez, Bob insisted from the start that the Jewish defense movement must concentrate on attacking Nazi philosophy and its denial of human rights. Notice that phrase, human rights, comes in, same as from Samuel Untermeyer, rather than on the direct refutation of anti-Semitic propaganda. So what he's saying there is, we're not going to take on their arguments, we're going to talk about them, like what Untermeyer said, like what Churchill did. We do not engage in arguments with them. Obviously, we can lose those arguments. So it's all about going on the attack. It's not about civilly engaging or debating anything. It's about vilifying our enemies, our sworn hated enemies, who we intend to destroy, who we intend to bring to their knees. Henriquez again says, Bob insisted that propaganda should be directed against, quote, pursuing peace without caring for freedom and justice, unquote, a summary of the British policy of appeasement. I.e., basically, we're here to force Britain to adopt our foreign policy, which is regime change or war. So you see that peace was in the crosshairs. Appeasement, which meant keeping peace, was in the crosshairs. It's very frank about it, right? Not ashamed. And this was written in the 60s. This book has been out there for decades. As David Irving says, £50,000, which was the amount that the New Court meeting had made available, quote, was a colossal sum for such an organisation to butter around in 36, 5 times the annual budget of the British Council, unquote. And of course, it was only initially 50,000. And I would add to that the British Council, anyway, was set up for the same purposes. The British Council had only just been founded, I think, the year before. And it was created by Reginald Leaper, the man, I call him Rex, the man who introduced Churchill or urged him to join the Focus. So it's funny that Irving mentions the British Council. It's another body that was working to the same purpose. But the British Council was a state body. It was set up by Rex Leaper instigated it, but the first head of it was Lord Lloyd. Lord Lloyd was, along with Churchill and Leo Amery, the most fanatical person of any party. They were all Tories, but of any party, of any figures in the whole of British politics, those 3 men were the most extreme anti-German, anti-Hitler people. So the Focus was working alongside the British Council, really, but with a much bigger budget and secret. The British Council, if you don't know, just take a look at what they do now. I mean, it's embarrassing. It's It's one of the most important organisations in projecting a ridiculous version of Britain to the world. Right? If you've seen, if you've ever seen the infamous bit of footage of a British woman in a tent in Afghanistan, informing women in burqas about the importance of Marcel Duchamp's toilet to Western culture, that is a British Council project. They also worked with Rory Stewart's wife. I can't remember. It was like Dolphins or Rainbows or something. Some organisation. That was them. That was them. It's called soft power. It's praised as soft power, but it's the soft power of soft people. It is powerful. I mean, it's influential. It does affect people's minds, but the disgraceful, disgusting thing about it is that it makes Britain look like it's just lefty. Anyway, getting off the point. Quoting myself here, both the Focus and the Board of Deputies appear to have been subsidiary, at least financially, to the unnamed leaders of Anglo Jewry who met at New Court and initiated that secret fund. So yeah, that secret fund, that 50,000, it was to help the Focus and the Board of Deputies. And to make that clear, Enriquez says, by tremendous efforts, Bob raised further gifts to the fund to keep pace with its expenditure. This Bob, by the way, but Robert Whaley-Cohen, seems to have been an amazingly energetic person. Just seems to have lived, like Churchill, just lived like several lives in one. Incredibly hardworking, busy. Even when he's really, really busy with loads of things, he would still take on another job like this. And he's also a very forceful, pushy person as well. Like in his biography, there's a bit where he's on holiday, I think, and he's on a boat, like a pleasure boat, going somewhere, just having dinner. And there's an orchestra, just a small orchestra of a few people playing. One of them was playing the cello. He happened to have been a good cellist, and he was so unhappy with with the person playing. He asked to just take over and just got his own cello out and started playing. And the other person had to probably go sit with his wife. I don't know, with Bob's wife. Anyway, Bob raised further gifts. By tremendous efforts, Bob raised further gifts to the fund to keep pace with its expenditure. It was found that the work of the fund inevitably overlapped the official defence work of the Board of Deputies. Accordingly, a very substantial annual sum was paid by the fund to the president of the board, Neville Lasky, KC, King's Counsel, so that he could temporarily sacrifice his legal practice and devote himself wholly to the coordination of Jewish defence. The point of mentioning that is just like the Board of Deputies was just a vehicle, right? We're talking about even the Board of Deputies was like a front group. That's thought of as like the most representative body of Jews in Britain. In fact, some people would argue it only represents maybe 2/3. And, you could argue about how well it represents those. But it's treated as quite official. But it's a relatively prestigious organisation. I mean, if the Board of Deputies asks an MP to say something, they usually say it. People are craven towards them. I'm talking about now. But yeah, the Board of Deputies seems to have been, subsidiary really to these leaders of Anglo Jewry who are just, they're not an organisation. They're just the top guys, the most rich and powerful and influential Jews in Britain, or at least some of them. So now we come to who was in the Focus, who joined. I think this is quite instructive, right? Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party and later Prime Minister. Harold Macmillan, a Tory MP at the time, somewhat eccentric at the time, but yeah, he later became Tory leader and Prime Minister after the war as well. Anthony Eden was not a member. He didn't like to join anything where he would fall into Churchill's shadow. He saw Churchill as a rival for the future leadership, and he didn't want to look like a supporter of his, so he didn't join it. But he was totally on board. He was working to the same purposes. Brendan Bracken, who I think was a Tory MP, he was a journalist as well. He was from Ireland. He apparently lied about his past, so he was covering something up. He seems to have been corrupt. He was a go-between between Churchill and various people, including Bernard Baruch and several other. He seemed to be a fixer. He seemed to be a general fixer and agent for Churchill. Also quite influential in his own right, because he had some money, and he took part ownership of The Economist magazine as well. The peace activist Norman Angell, who had been a Labour MP for a while. To be a Labour MP in the 20s and 30s, by the way, was generally you were a proper socialist. Norman Angell won the Nobel Peace Prize because he was just always going on about peace. But this group that he joined, it was for regime change, So he's like a deluded figure at best, maybe worse. Violet Bonham Carter, as I mentioned. Now, she was particularly close personally to Churchill. She was born Violet Asquith. She was the daughter of Herbert Henry Asquith, who, by the way, was the Prime Minister who declared the First World War on Britain's part against Germany. I don't think he was as enthusiastic as Churchill was, but he was a wartime Prime Minister. More than just wartime. He declared the war. With Churchill's encouragement, especially with Lloyd George's encouragement. Anyway, Violet Bonham Carter was his daughter, obviously related to the, Helena Bonham Carter and that famous family. And she was a left-wing Liberal MP. I can't really go all into the vicissitudes of Liberal Party politics, but suffice to say that they had been one of the two biggest parties before Labour came up. Labour may have stolen their clothes. At any rate, the Liberal Party declined terribly in the 20s. And in the 30s was just a sort of much smaller party, but, like the Lib Dems now, they're not nothing. But it had a very strong left-wing element, including lots of these guys who joined this. As I mentioned also, Eleanor Rathbone, who I don't think called herself a socialist, but she was. Two other members were Henry Mond and Robert Mond, also Lord Melchett. One of them was called Lord Melchett. They were two Jewish brothers who I think controlled ICI, which was a massive... I remember that being a company when I was a kid. It's gone bust since, but ICI was, I think, the biggest or one of the biggest chemicals companies in Britain. Notice, obviously, that chemicals companies are interested in war, right? Making explosives and all sorts of stuff. Another two members were James de Rothschild and Dorothy Pinto. Dorothy Pinto was also, I think, born Rothschild. They were first cousins and they were married. That was a thing in the Rothschild family through the 19th century, but also in these two into the 20th century. They were first cousins and married. James de Rothschild may well have been one of the leaders of Anglo Jewry at the New Court meetings. It would make sense, right? If not, one of his relatives, like, for instance, I would think Victor Rothschild was probably there. He was Lord Rothschild. He was the third Baron Rothschild. He was, at the time, Lord Rothschild. So, yeah, Victor Rothschild was probably part of the funding. He was also extremely rich, Victor Rothschild. And I would imagine all the members of the Rothschild family were very, very rich. Yeah. Another member was Archibald Sinclair, who I mentioned before, leader of the Liberal Party. It wasn't just that. He also was just an old friend of Churchill. He fought with Churchill in the Great War. He was an officer under him, I believe. And Churchill made him Air Minister in the Second World War. Another member who you may have heard of is a fairly obscure figure, but Arthur Salter. Okay, most people have not heard of Arthur Salter. He was a senior civil servant, I think, in the First World War, and through to the Second World War as well. He distinguished himself by his fervent support for the European unification cause. He was a comrade and ally of Jean Monnet. This is a whole different story, so I'll leave that apart. But you can see a video on my Odyssey channel where I talked about Jean Monnet. It was called The Scourge of Sovereignty. Anyway, there's a lot of links. A lot of the same people who were in this group went on to become supporters of the Europe idea, but they mean Europe under one state. That idea existed before the Second World War. It certainly took off in the late 40s. Yeah. Most of these people found themselves ennobled, if they weren't already, under Churchill. Another member, and I think a particularly disgusting figure, is Robert Boothby. Robert Boothby was a Tory MP. I don't think he was of noble birth, I'm not sure, but he became a Lord Boothby later. There's a lot to say about him. You may want to watch the documentary. What's it called? Like, it's something like The Gangster and the Pervert Peer. It's on YouTube. It's about his relationship with Ronnie Cray, and I don't mean a love relationship, although they were both gay. I think that's how they were tied together. They went with the same male prostitutes or something like that. Anyway, Robert Boothby was a co-founder of the Popular Front. That was, a Soviet initiative. It was to unify all the forces of the left and centre left across Europe, across the world, to unify, to try and take over Britain, France, anywhere, and to, do the same as the focus, redirect foreign policy and all policy against Germany, to bring down Germany at all costs, to bring down Hitler at all costs. And Robert Boothby was a Tory who just worked for the Soviets. I mean, not in every way, but he was their friend. He also found himself given a position, I think, in Churchill's wartime government, and as I say, became a lord. We know he was corrupt. His own biography shows it. He took money from various immigrants from Europe who wanted to leave after, Richard Weininger was one, a person who just paid Boothby to help get him into Britain. He could get into Britain, but not with all his money. Boothby could help him get his money in as well. Simply a left-winger, Boothby, and a corrupt bastard, and compromised. Totally compromised. So just both bribed and probably blackmailed as well. Another member was Hugh Dalton, who had already been a Labour minister and was to be one again after the war, and joined Churchill's wartime government. And if you read the book Labour and the Gulag by Giles Uddy, Dalton was just an apologist for the Soviets. I don't think he was a Marxist himself, but he was so friendly to them that he might as well have been. So just an ideal figure for this, obviously. Three other figures. I mentioned Rex Leeper, the foreign office guy. I don't think he came to these. I don't think he could be seen at these meetings, but he was obviously like a connector, a fixer for it. Henry Wickham Steed, who I mentioned before, he, as we said, he was a journalist for the Times earlier in his career. I think it was under him as editor that the Times published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the 1910s when it was new. I think the protocols were not, they are fictional. But I think it was under him as editor, the Times published them as is this real? Should we take this seriously? It was like an open question. Generally regarded later to be made up. I think they are fictional, but I think whoever wrote them aimed to, intended them as some sort of warning, But whether a warning of something they'd really seen or just something in their mind, I don't know. But Henry Wickham Steed was an important member of the Focus as a journalist, as a very experienced and well-connected, respected journalist. He was useful asset. Another member was Louis Spears, who was genuinely sort of binational. He was English French. One parent was French. I think he's probably bilingual. Lived in France some of the time, and I think he definitely was bribed by the Czechoslovak government of Masaryk and Benes. But I think Louis Spears was probably also working for the French state as well. I just remembered I mentioned the Popular Front and how they tried to form left-wing governments across Europe. They did actually do so in France. The government of Léon Blum, who was of Jewish ancestry. It was a Popular Front government. In France, that was more plausible because they had a proportional representation system. But the Popular Front did actually form several governments. Louis Spears, as I mentioned, he was like an agent of the Czechs and maybe the French state. He became, I think, ambassador to France under Churchill as well. He was also at some point given a directorship at an industrial firm in Czechoslovakia, which the Rothschilds owned. May have been a reward for services rendered. I don't know, speculate. Another member, another journalist, he's only known by his initials, R. Montague Bell. I don't know what his first name was, but he according to Irving, arranged the publication of a series of so-called vigilance pamphlets. Remember earlier, Churchill, even as early as 34, was mentioning preparedness, right? Preparedness and vigilance, they're terms for arming up. Not just arms, like not just increasing arms, but generally militarization and increasing suspicion, increasing spying, increasing everything, vigilance against the threat, whether the threat's real or not. But so, yeah, he, as a member of the Focus, started putting out these vigilance pamphlets, basically just to scare the public. It's like a kind of journalistic terrorism in a way. Like I was taught in school, like warmongers. This was said about Hitler. I was taught this about Hitler. What do you do as a warmonger? What do you do as a dictator? You create an external enemy, a great looming external enemy. You make them seem big, shadowy, malevolent, unreasonable, can't be reasoned with, and always external, always like alien, if you can portray them as foreign as possible. The Hun with big underbite and those pictures from the First World War, like the Hun, but they're actually boars, they're actually pigs. This sort of stuff, right? The same was done in America before both World Wars, like especially the Morgan interests in the First World War. They had this preparedness campaign, and it was like, let's get ready for when the Germans attack us. There's obviously no proof that the Germans were going to attack them. I'm talking like 1915 or whatever. Anyway, Montague Bell arranged the publication of those. They were written by another journalist, Colin Coote, who was then a leader writer of the Times, and other well-known journalists. Now, I mentioned Reginald Leeper. He was like a connector, a fixer for this. Also, the guy who instigated the British Council, also obviously someone working at the Foreign Office to undermine the foreign policy of his own government, and he was doing that. He, as described elsewhere, already had a circle of diplomatic correspondence, including at least one Soviet agent, by the way, William Norman Ewer, EWER, I think he was Scottish, who coordinated their reports. They would get in a room with him like every day or several times a week, all very friendly and chummy, all like, oh, can I get you something? Reginald Leeper would have a group of them just come to his office, and they would basically coordinate what they were going to report. And the more info he let them in on, the more inclined they were to go along with what he wanted. And there was, backslapping, mutual benefit. I'm sure some of them still thought of themselves as independent, but it's like a coterie of basically pro-Soviet, anti-German diplomatic correspondence, meaning people who report on diplomatic goings on. So while certain journalists were directly affiliated or directly attending Focus meetings and doing things for the Focus, there was also others who were working to the same purposes, but not members. So I just think it's important to colour that in. And these meetings, later on, in 1939, Lord Halifax, right, Edward Wood, Lord Halifax who was Foreign Secretary under Neville Chamberlain. He's talked of as the arch appeaser by critics of appeasement, right? But Lord Halifax was very pro-appeasement until after the Munich settlement, which was where Czechoslovakia agreed to surrender the Sudetenland to Germany under pressure, obviously. After that, he became very anti-appeasement, and that's just not mentioned by the historians. But Lord Halifax, by I think February of 1939, had swung the other way, had swung pro-war so much. I could give you a lot of quotes about that, but he had changed his position 180, and he was speaking at a meeting of the Focus and was very well received. Him being well received means he said pro-war things, or at least confrontational things about Germany. Joseph Kennedy, the US ambassador to Britain at the time, also attended a Focus meeting, and so did his son, John F. Kennedy. I don't think he ever mentioned that in his memoirs. So I'll describe, just having a drink. I'll describe what the Focus did and what they slotted into as well and how they worked, right? So journalists like, I mentioned Montague Bell. Sorry, it's H.T. Montague Bell. I don't know anything about this guy. I assume it was a man. Probably a really important figure, but there's so much detail reading about all this stuff. You just get an ever-growing list of things to look up, connections to look into, and what was this person's background? Who's that person? Sometimes you find out this the same person under two different names. Like I mentioned Lord Cecil earlier. As I say, like I just saw one mention somewhere of Cecil of Chelwood. I'm like, who's that? Oh, right, that's Robert Gascoigne Cecil. He was the son of the Marquis of Salisbury. There's so much detail. Anyway, journalists like H.T. Montague Bell were employed by the Focus to write letters to the papers, right? So this is another angle. They're putting out their own pamphlets. They're trying to influence the existing commentators in the papers and editors and owners. They're also writing letters to the papers as just a concerned citizen, right? So it looks spontaneous. It looks like it's coming from all angles. It looks like a growing consensus of its own accord, not organised, right? To write letters to the papers and pressure them to go more anti-German and ignore the Soviets, to apologise for whatever the Soviets did, and so on and so on. Irving says, by late 1936, the editors of the influential weekly journals, The Spectator, The New Statesman, The Economist, and Time and Tide were wooed and won. And that's Wilson Harris, Basil Kingsley Martin, Lady Rhondda, and Harcourt Johnston. They were joined by, quote, Sir Walter Leighton and A.J. Cummings, chairman and chief commentator of the News Chronicle, as well as Lady Violet Bonham Carter and two BBC executives. As I mentioned, the BBC had already helped publicise the Anti-Nazi Council's demos and had already given Churchill amplification for his warnings about Teutonic domination as early as 1934. So that I mentioned that in connection with two BBC executives. I guess they were not supposed to be seen there. They were probably anonymous, right? We already talked about Bonham Carter, but these other names, right? The Spectator. So the editors of all the main weekly magazines, news magazines, were all involved or wooed and won, right? Won to the cause. Didn't have to come to the dinners, but they agreed to report in the same way. The Spectator, we know what that's like. It's the same back then. I think the Spectator has been sort of fake right, concede everything to the left bullshit since centuries ago. The New Statesman was the magazine of the Fabian Society, simply left-wing, straightforwardly left-wing socialist. The Economist, have you read The Economist? It's not actually about economics, some of it is. It reports on news from all around the world. It's actually a very informative news journal, but it's totally globalist. I don't know if it was back then, but I mean, the Rothschild family and I believe the Agnelli family, if you heard of Gianni Agnelli, who was the owner of the Fiat company, but that's not just Fiat cars, that's a million different brands. They were part owners of it later. It's changed ownership, but at the time, The Economist was I think controlling stake by Henry Strakosch and Brendan Bracken, both close supporters of Churchill. Henry Strakosch, of course, gave Churchill loads of money. And Time and Tide, I guess that doesn't exist anymore, but that's another one of these weekly magazines. But yeah, these magazines all have much smaller readership than the daily newspapers, much smaller then and now. But they're read by people in and around Parliament. They're read by other journalists, other editors, other owners, right? Important people, basically, people with sway. Now, as I said, two other people involved were A.J. Cummings and Sir Walter Leighton of the News Chronicle. Walter Leighton was a Quaker, by the way, and I recommend people keep an eye on the new book coming out soon, I think, from Ed Dutton, The Quaker Question. Quakers just seem to get involved with all sorts of stuff. But Sir Walter Leighton, the News Chronicle was, led by Quakers. And again, doesn't exist anymore, I don't think, but it was strongly left-wing. And I mean, we're talking like liberal left. We're not talking like Marxist or anything you could confuse with Marxism. But centre leftists, liberal lefties can be just as self-righteous, can be just as belligerent in their own way. They're not trying to overthrow capitalism, right? But they are belligerent towards what they see as like the great enemies. Again, Quakers are supposed to be like the most pacific people, but the record suggests otherwise. Quakers support hope, not hate. now, right? The Roundtree Foundation is a Quaker organisation. They support Hope Not Hate. It's not a peaceful or nice or humane organisation. That's for persecuting and vilifying and destroying the lives of anyone who stands up to the ruling class. It's a state establishment enforcement body. Anyway, the News Chronicle was like liberal lefty or a left-wing newspaper, massive circulation, one of the biggest. And so you can see how much of the media have I not mentioned. I'm afraid I can't answer that perfectly because I don't know. I don't have a list of all the media organisations around at the time. But the BBC, right, which was all the broadcasting in Britain, all the legal broadcasting in Britain, was on board, right? The News Chronicle, all the big weekly journals, loads of other media interests who I've named, loads of other senior journalists who I've named, and there's more that I'll come on to now. There were others, I quoted myself, others whom the Focus left alone as they were already model citizens, right? So there was no reason to reach out to them. They're already doing exactly what the Focus wanted. One was the Express's cartoonist David Lowe. You could have a quick Google of David Lowe. You'll recognise his cartoon style. They're famous. They continue to be famous. Lauded, celebrated cartoons. This guy was a complete piece of shit. Anyway. His counterpart at the Mirror, the Daily Mirror, which was so the Daily Express was the biggest newspaper in the world by circulation at the time. One of the biggest, at least in Britain, was the Daily Mirror, and the cartoonist there was Philip Zek, or I think his real name was Zekhanovskaya. He was also a director of the Jewish Chronicle, by the way. David Lowe was basically a supporter of the Soviets. So probably Philip Zek was as well. But, cartoons really can cut through. Obviously, we've seen how memes can be effective, right? A well-judged cutting cartoon can do the work of 1,000 articles, right? We know that. So this is why I mentioned the cartoonists. David Lowe was basically implicitly pro-Soviet, except there's one cartoon of his which people love to share around now. It's where it's mocking Stalin and Hitler at the time that they made their pact. But of course, lefties who supported the Soviets did hate the Soviets at that moment because the Soviets allied with the Nazis. Such a twisted history, but there you go. But yeah, the Jewish Chronicle is like a mainstay of the Jewish community in Britain, right? Of Anglo Jewry, you could say. It sort of speaks for them more than any other newspaper. Again, as with the Board of Deputies, it doesn't represent the whole thing. But I just mean to emphasize like how much tie-in there was with what is called the Jewish community, what is treated as a body that speaks for Jews, whether it really does or not. We are talking about, as Churchill said, the basis of the Focus was Jewish resentment about the abominable treatment of their fellows in Germany, right? This is a Jewish organisation in that sense. And Philip Zek was an immigrant or son of an immigrant from Odessa. I mentioned that a lot of people were like immigrants from the Russian Empire, like Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire, because that in itself is a hugely transformative event. That wave of people, hundreds of thousands of people flowing into Germany, France, and especially Britain and America in the 1880s to the 1910s. It's transformative of the history of the world, I would argue. So I just think it's important to mention these people's background when they're of that demographic. And as I say, I've written a few essays on that. The main one you could look at is called Ties Abroad, as in they had ties abroad. Now, I mentioned about the ownership of The Economist, Brendan Bracken and Henry Strakosch, both close friends of Churchill. Walter Citrine, as we know, was the president. He was the head of the general secretary of the TUC, but he was also president of the Focus. So the formal figurehead, I suppose. As the head of the TUC, that gave him a directorship of the Daily Herald, which was a Labour supporting newspaper. So the Herald was on board as well, right? The Daily Mirror and the Sunday Pictorial, which was part of the Daily Mirror's group, doesn't exist anymore, but that was the second biggest pictorial newspaper in Britain. That was a thing back then, pictorial newspapers. The Mirror and the Pictorial were already vehemently anti-Hitler, so there was no need for the Focus to reach out to them. They were already doing the same work. Likewise, the Picture Post, which was the biggest pictorial newspaper. The Picture Post, by the way, was founded by a man who called himself Stefan Laurent, but his real name was Istvan Reich, I think. He was a Jewish immigrant from from Hungary. I don't know whether he had originally come from, well, Reich sounds like a German name. So maybe he came from Germany originally, but he's someone who's referred to as a refugee from Hungary. But what those people don't mention is that he was part of the Bela Cohen regime that had tried to impose, proper Soviet communism on Hungary and failed. Well, they succeeded for a few months in taking over, but then they were driven out. Anyway, the Picture Post, the biggest pictorial newspaper and absolutely staunchly anti-Hitler, anti-German, anti-Nazi through the 30s was sorry, I can't remember the start of my sentence, but was founded by that guy who was a vehemently anti-German and anti-Hitler Jewish immigrant, and was 100% for regime change in Germany and for what that meant for Britain as well. And the Focus, along with having all of this support and mutual interest with the media, with like so much of the media that I've mentioned, also formed its own publishing company, the Focus Publishing Company, which took over the magazine Headway, which also doesn't exist now. But the Headway was the magazine of the League of Nations Union. The League of Nations Union is not the same as the League of Nations. It was a union of people in Britain who supported the League of Nations, which by the mid-30s seems to have just been taken over and was controlled by leftists, as most organisations are if they don't prevent themselves being taken over. And so the Headway was already suitable. Like, they bought it, they took it over. And as Eugen Speer says, the policy of the new Headway would be to turn out the Conservative government. That's his words. So just like quite proudly saying, we, people who moved into Britain from abroad, our aim was to overthrow the government and replace it with one who would do what we wanted rather than what the British people had voted for. It really is as brazen as that. And like, no shame, stated without any shame or embarrassment. Obviously, in the post-war war, you could say that without embarrassment because the sort of post-war consensus, the ideological consensus, was that this had all been correct and proper and necessary, and that should have been done earlier and harder. David Irving says, quote, at Whaley Cohen's request, that's Robert Whaley Cohen, Bob, the guy who brought the secret fund, who connected the leaders of Anglo Jewry and the Board of Deputies and the Shell Company and the Focus. At Whaley Cohen's request, Brendan Bracken released German-born Werner Knopp, who had been foreign news editor at Bracken's Financial News and Banker magazine since 1935. The Focus set him up in an office in the fountain yard of one of the ancient Inns of Court near Fleet Street. Knopp's front group, Union Time Limited, disguised as a press agency, was funded, quote, by a group of British businessmen and newspaper editors. We have no more information than that. But Marcus Bennett, writing in, I think, Tribune magazine, describes Union Time as, quote, a front for various German emigres, that normally means Jews, normally means communist Jews, or, socialist subversives, normally emigres because they were Jews, left Germany, working across a front for various German emigres working across various professional fields to encourage anti-Nazi opinion in Britain and combat Nazi propaganda in general. Combating Nazi propaganda is exactly the same as what Robert Whaley Cohen said the Focus needed to do. And Marcus Bennett continues, it was Union Time Limited which had camouflaged, among many others, the activities of Hilda Meisel, Meisel, who approached the Labour MP George Strauss, asking for money to murder Hitler. George Strauss was Jewish as well. Strauss sent her to the City of London to meet Werner Knopp. Knopp granted her the necessary financial support. And Knopp, as we know, as we know from Irving, was funded by a group of British businessmen and newspaper editors. We don't know who, but we're talking about a terrorist operation, right? when she wanted money, she wanted funds for which to attempt a murder of Hitler, she went to this guy, Werner Knopp, who had been writing for Financial News and Banker magazine under Brendan Bracken and was given over to set up by the Focus as a front group called Union Time Limited, which was actually, I guess, a slush fund or a funding vehicle for sabotage and murder, like Black Ops, pre-war. This is 1936 or 37. Again, before anything like Kristallnacht or anything like that, they're trying to. The Focus is tied up, is like working with and knowingly working with people who are trying to murder the leader of a foreign state. I don't know what do you say about this? But so the Focus was actually part of like a Black Ops network. Amazing stuff, right? So it's not even just a vehicle for Churchill's career or for propaganda against Germany or anything. It's also literally helping attempts on his life. The Focus also partnered with Cooperation Press Service, another press agency run by a guy who called himself Emery Reeves, but his real name was Imre Revers. I think he had also come out of Hungary, also Jewish, who offered Churchill a much wider readership and larger fees for his newspaper articles by syndicating them across loads of different countries. He did the same, Emery Reeves this was, did the same for Clement Attlee, for Anthony Eden, for Alfred Duff Cooper, also a fanatical anti-German type, and anti-German politicians across Europe, including Leon Blum, who I mentioned before, who was a popular front guy and became the president of France. I don't think I've put this in my notes, but Churchill referred to this operation that Emery Reeves ran, Imre Revers, this press agency operation, which like Churchill referred to it as the new encirclement of Germany, as in like we're surround everything they say, every statement they make, we immediately hit them with 1 or 5 or 10 of our own, hitting back. Just doesn't matter if it's true, doesn't matter if what you're saying makes sense, or if all your predictions you just pretend you didn't say them later or whatever. Doesn't matter. It's just about the mood. It's about the vibe. It's about making the Nazis look stupid, making them look extreme, or just making them look like they're on the back foot. Sometimes it was about that. It was about making them look. It's about like claiming wins where there weren't any. That was another thing. We'll come to that. Like at the time of the Munich settlement, Hitler wasn't satisfied, even though he got what he wanted. He got the Sudetenland at the Munich settlement. This is November, I think September 1938. Hitler got what he wanted. However, he also was outraged by the reaction of the press in Britain. And I've found out since that was driven specifically by Reginald Leeper. Reginald Leeper like stirred up all his little group of diplomatic correspondents, and not just him, but it was like his idea, I think, to claim that Hitler had actually lost and backed down. I don't know how they did that, what sort of rhetorical dance they did to do that, but he set about to convince people and to humiliate Hitler, basically, to make it seem like a big L. It's a strange thing. Like, I'm sure it made sense at the time. Anyway, Emery Reeves' Cooperation Press Service was an ongoing version of that, right? It was just mock them sometimes, deride them, vilify them, castigate them, mock them again. Whatever worked at the time, but just make them look like the enemy, by placing articles all over the place. And also just making it look like a big, grand, friendly international effort. Like Hitler's the odd one out. Hitler's the weirdo who's spoiling the party. Everyone else is just trying to, they'll pretend they're trying to keep the peace. Obviously they weren't. Anyway, I would just emphasize how Churchill and Rex Leeper and all the figures involved in the Focus, but especially Churchill above all, their aim had been since before he even joined the Focus, before the Focus was what it became, right? Was to just create alarm in general about Germany, right? Churchill, as I say, he made this speech about Teutonic domination in 1934, before any of the things that people cite about Hitler being a threat, as proof that he was a threat, and as proof that Churchill had great foresight in seeing that threat. All these things that people cite, none of them had happened by 1934, and yet it was already the great external enemy. It was already considered perfectly legit to just accuse them of trying to take over the world. Now, Churchill found that just bluntly accusing them of doing that wasn't enough. He really needed to convince people that they had, not only that they had the evil intent, but that they had the power to smash Britain. Now, this was always ridiculous, right? Because it always assumed that Germany would just, all of a sudden, for no reason, launch its entire air force at Britain. Right? Obviously, that means flying over several other countries. It's so ridiculous. Obviously, leaving none at home. So, like, just Poland could just attack them. Obviously, the defensive side, so Britain's being attacked from the air by Germany. Obviously, the defensive side can muster its entire air force, whereas the attacking side cannot bring its whole air force, right? They have to have something at home as well. Anyway, Churchill set about what I would just plainly call a lying campaign. I can't remember when he started. I think he started this around the time when he made that Teutonic domination speech. But his lying campaign, this is a famous thing that he was like trying to warn Parliament. This is what sort of Andrew Roberts type historians will tell you, that he was trying to warn Parliament and trying to warn the country for years before, from 35 or 34, trying to warn Parliament about the threat of a German air attack, right? Which was just completely imaginary. But it was all derived from false statistics supplied to him, to Churchill. Churchill using parliamentary privilege, you can say almost anything in Parliament, not be told off for it. But he was being supplied these false figures, complete nonsense figures, by Robert Van Sittert, the head of the Foreign Office, the civil service head of the Foreign Office, one of the most malignant figures in British history, I think. And several different men from the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6. I can't go into great detail about this, but because there's so much detail, and a lot of it's shadowy, a lot of it was obviously secret. But some of it has been written about, including by, I think there is an official history written by, I don't think it's by SIS, but by the Foreign Office maybe, which I quote from in one of my essays. So there is some official stuff written about this. But Churchill, he could get away with reading out what was basically like stolen data, that shouldn't have been supplied to him. He could get away with that by just being vague about the origins of it, and just parliamentary privilege meant that he wouldn't be pressed on it. And he did what he and Samuel Untermeyer and Robert Whaley-Cohen and everyone did to the Nazis. He did this to anyone who disagreed with him. He just refused to talk to them, just talked about them, just avoided answering any counterclaims. So he just stand up in Parliament, say the Germans now have 3,000 aircraft bearing down, like ready to launch against us. It was made up figures, and he would just walk out afterwards or whatever. But it's just to have it on the record and just have it quoted in the papers. It doesn't matter if anyone disputes it, just ignore them. Somehow that worked. And people did dispute it in the cabinet, in Parliament, in the press. But Churchill, he had a lot of influential people behind him, especially after he joined the Focus, right? He had most of the media ready to back him up, and it worked. So when you hear people say that public opinion, there is some truth to this, that public opinion was, for confronting Germany, at least by 1939, by late 1939. There is some truth to that. But think of how that was achieved. It wasn't their initiative, was it? It wasn't from the people. It wasn't from ordinary people, working in Stepney or whatever, that the idea of declaring war on Germany if they were to dare attack Poland or whatever, however it happened, that idea did not come from the common man, right? That it was spread among the common man through the newspapers, through broadcasting, and so on, and by the image of Churchill that was built up by these people. Think about how people talk about the Daily Mail. Think about how leftists talk about the Daily Mail, and think about how leftists talk about the public and how we're all supposedly fooled and duped by. It's usually the Daily Mail, sometimes by the Express, sometimes by Farage, but we're all dupes for them. We all just believe what they say and do what they want, right? I hate when leftists say that, but it is possible to spread false ideas among the public and to create an atmosphere of impending danger, which is false. You can do that. It can be done. And it was done. I mentioned, Reginald Leeper at the Foreign Office coordinating the diplomatic correspondence of most of the major newspapers. So that was one leg of this great effort. Richard Cockett, who I mentioned earlier, says, quote, that group used the news department of the Foreign Office to give out news of conditions in Germany, statistics of German rearmament, reports of German concentration camps, to enhance this pessimistic view of Germany. The leak to the Daily Telegraph in 1935 was supposed to contribute to this general picture. So yeah, sometimes they just leaked stuff as well. Just leaking illegally, obviously. Leaking false information. But leaks, sometimes when stuff comes from an anonymous source, some people actually think it's more credible. It's like, it builds up the picture of like the government putting a lid on all this stuff. Anyway, alongside these efforts, I think it is important, as I mentioned, Robert Van Sittert, the head of the civil service head of the Foreign Office, obviously the political head is the Foreign Secretary. Robert Van Sittert from 1930 to 38 was the Mandarin, the top Mandarin. I think he was of Dutch descent, Van Sittart. He ran his own intelligence network called the Z Organization. This was in collaboration with SIS, with MI6. I'm not sure exactly what that means. So I guess just he met with senior people at SIS and they allowed him to use their existing network because he was working to the same purposes. So this implies that SIS was basically leaning on the anti-German side as well, right? Churchill had his own equivalent. So there was the Z Organization under Van Sittert stroke MI6. Churchill had his own intelligence network as well. Victor Rothschild, who I mentioned earlier, the third Baron Rothschild, Lord Rothschild, also had his own intelligence network, which you can read a bit about in John Costello's book, The Mask of Treachery. Very good book. And Churchill's network included people like a communist Jew from Germany called Jürgen Kuczynski, who was just a career liar. I'll describe, right? I'll substantiate that in a moment. I say in one of my essays, Churchill's intelligence network included, Kuczynski by the way, Kuczynski was, apart from being already a known member of the Communist Party of Germany, was also a Soviet agent. I'll come back to that in a second. But Churchill's network also included Leopold Schwarzschild. I guess that would be Black Shield. Schwarzschild. Also Jewish, a journalist and publisher. Churchill referred to these guys as two German refugees of high ability and inflexible purpose. The reason for that it was particularly absurd to use info from Jürgen Kuczynski was that, as Irving says, after publishing an anonymous article in Brendan Bracken's The Banker magazine, that magazine again, in February 1937, with tongue-in-cheek supposed calculations of Hitler's annual arms budget, a tongue-in-cheek article, he was contacted by certain circles, probably meaning the Focus. I think that meant, it was Churchill and his crew. So this communist Jewish immigrant from Germany, he'd written a joke calculation of Hitler's arms budget. But obviously that's a response to the sort of the issue, like Churchill and co. putting that issue into the news, right? This constant threat of German rearmament and spending and so on. Jürgen Kuczynski had, after putting that joke out, he had been contacted by certain circles, i.e. Churchill and co. And these he had ruthlessly milked of both funds for the party coffers, the Communist Party coffers, and secret information for the Soviet Union. These circles, he said by way of identification, were those that came to power in 1940 with the overthrow of Chamberlain. That was Churchill and co. Kuczynski also drafted a blimpish brochure, this is still Irving, on Hitler and the Empire, to which an RAF Air Commodore wrote the foreword. Blimpish meaning like Colonel Blimp, meaning like a bit like Bulldog and Spitfire nationalism now, right? Or like sort of, brusque and brash, militaristic tone, right? Kaczynski said, "I chose the pen name James Turner. The whole thing was a rather improbable romp." And Irving says, Turner's line was, he chuckled, to deny any personal dislike of fascism. That was a matter for the Germans alone. If only it were not such a danger for the British Empire. That's what Kaczynski said. If only, fascism is a matter for the Germans alone. If only it wasn't such a danger to us, for the British Empire. As if Kaczynski wasn't a danger to the British Empire, right? All communists, the Bolsheviks especially, since 1917, the main target for subversion was the British Empire. And was still at this time. Because it was the main enemy. America sort of became the main enemy after the Second World War, or during. But so I just want to emphasize what happened there. So, like, a communist Jew from Germany pretended to be a guy called James Turner to co-opt British imperialism for the purposes of the focus, for anti-fascism, to make it seem sort of patriotic and imperialistic, to want to bring down Hitler. And this was Churchill's approach as well. Like, but obviously Churchill didn't pretend to be someone else. But just think of these sort of Twitter accounts now, like Inevitable West, run by some Indian guy. All these other ones, like they're called, they're like God Save Great Britain. They're either run by Indians or Jews, or like other, people of other, like almost never are they actually English people. This is just an old method of like co-opting a controlled opposition, basically. Like, ostensibly, like people who like flags and the just Britain, just generally the idea of Britain. It seems to be possible to dupe them into supporting basically the left and our enemies by just pretending to be. All you just do is just call yourself James Turner. Simple as that. That was being done back then, with the support of the Focus and with the support of Churchill, knowingly. Besides that, just talking of intelligence networks, Henry Strakosch, before he was the guy who bailed Churchill out, we'll come to that, he was also just part of Churchill's intelligence network. So he was supplying alarming reports to Churchill of what Germany was buying. And I mean, metal, steel products, chemicals, whatever, stuff that can be used for military production. We've no idea whether any of this was true, right? But Strakosch, the basis for Strakosch's figures were his own company's exports to Germany. So he's telling Churchill to be afraid, and he's telling Churchill to tell the public to be afraid of the German threat that he himself is supplying for cash. So obviously he's not actually afraid of them. Strakosch was another Jewish immigrant from Austria, I believe. He was fairly old by this time. He'd already made a fortune. He'd moved out of Austria to South Africa and become like a multi-millionaire in those days' money. So extremely rich, but in gold mining. Seems that like many of the gold mining interests and diamond mining in South Africa were either like Jewish owned or Jewish financed. And Henry Strakosch, more famously, apart from being this supplier of false information, as I say, portraying his own activities as a threat, he was supplying Germany with chemicals and metals, I think. Apart from that, he's known, people who know about like Churchill's activities in the 30s and the Focus and so on. Henry Strakosch is known as a guy who gave Churchill loads of money, and he did. So in 1938, so this is after a lot of what I'm describing here, but in 1938, Churchill, who had money problems through, 6 or 7 different occasions in his life, he was in serious money trouble. I mean, serious by his standards. When he had money trouble, earlier in his life, Ernest Cassel, another Jewish immigrant, came out of Germany, was the guy who bailed him out at least once, maybe twice. A lot of money. Henry Strakosch went even further. I don't think Strakosch was as rich as Cassel, but he was rich enough that he gave away at least £20,000 to Churchill. I think it's a lot more than that. But Irving says that Churchill was hit with a demand, like basically had like big successful stock holdings in America and Canada that suddenly crashed. There was a really severe stock market crash in 38, maybe started in 37, but it hit Churchill in 38 anyway. or the bill came due. It was like, not only do you not have the whatever it was, £100,000 worth of stock that you thought that's all gone, because he was using margin as well, he was using leverage as well. Not only that, but you owe us nearly £20,000. This was a very pressing crisis for Churchill. I mean, he was about to basically sell Chartwell, his main mansion, and leave politics. This is why Strakosch got involved, right? Churchill was about to leave politics, and because politics didn't make much money. He could make money. He was making all right money from writing articles and books, but still, this guy, this fat drunkard, lived a very, very lavish, luxurious lifestyle. David Locke's book that I mentioned earlier is called No More Champagne. It's kind of a joke because Churchill's idea of cutting back wasn't even to stop drinking champagne. It was just to stop ordering champagne for a while. And he cut back to not giving it to all his guests, not ordering as much as before, and limiting himself to only a pint of champagne a day. I don't know if that's a joke or something, but anyway, he drank champagne all the time. And that's just champagne, cigars, the finest foods, everything, the finest of everything. But yeah, he never consistently had the income to sustain that. He was always hanging around with much richer people than himself. This is a reason why various people become corrupt. Like David Lloyd George was the same, but Lloyd George was of a much poorer, much less rich background. Anyway, back to Henry Strakosch. When Churchill found himself in a very pressing need for money and a lot of money, Henry Strakosch was sourced by Brendan Bracken, who already knew him, co-owned The Economist with him, as someone who might help. And Henry Strakosch apparently was very eager to help. All he asked in return was to join one of Churchill's dining clubs. I think it's called the Other Club, but basically nothing. I mean, that was a tiny forbearance, and I think Churchill liked the guy anyway, so no forbearance at all. The best part of £20,000. He also bailed Churchill again. Even I think he'd become prime minister by this point, or was just about to. But in 1940, he had money problems again. Strakosch gave him another several £1,000 gift. And then when Strakosch died in 1943, he left him another £20,000. But I don't know if that's the same amount just coming due. Like maybe, I think. Anyway, so he left him at least 20. In total, he gave him at least 25,000, maybe closer to 50,000. So we're talking huge amounts of money. That's, again, a fortune, millions and millions of pounds. David Locke says in his book that there was no question of like Churchill being bribed into supporting the Jews, or whatever like he thinks David Irving accuses. David Irving doesn't really say that. But yeah, it's true. Like Strakosch, it's not like anyone who says that Strakosch kind of was what sort of paid Churchill to become a supporter of all this, anti-Nazi stuff. Yeah, that's not true. What it was Strakosch identified him as someone who was already doing that and who he supported very strongly because of that. And thus was worth paying to keep in the cause, to keep him in politics, to keep him doing what he was doing. So you see there's this like support network of all sorts of people. Emery Reeves getting his voice out there all over the world. Henry Strakosch keeping him in politics. Robert Wade-Cohen amplifying his voice and all sorts of stuff. Loads of other people. Most of the media were part of a sort of support network for Churchill. As I said, Churchill was like what you could call a champion of Judea. Judea in the sense of that headline, Judea declares war on Germany. Declares war on Hitler, right? Churchill was a champion of that cause. He was someone who was worth supporting if they had that same aim. So I mentioned that Robert Van Sitter, head of the Foreign Office, and Churchill both had their own intelligence networks, as did Lord Rothschild. These networks, I think, overlapped with each other. We don't know exactly who was in them. We only know certain figures, but I think they did have certain figures in common. Maybe they were basically the same network of people. I think they were. But either way, both overlapped with what was the Industrial Intelligence Centre at the Committee for Imperial Defence. I'm sorry for this very wordy stuff. The Committee for Imperial Defence, the CID, that was set up in the 1900s decade to lobby for war against Germany. Basically, they didn't say so. That's a whole other story. I'll have to leave that aside. But a subcommittee of that, the Industrial Intelligence Centre at the CID. Obviously, what it sounds like, it was a. So the Committee for Imperial Defence, I don't know what authority that came under. Was that directly under the King or something? I'm not sure. I haven't looked this up. So was it a parliamentary committee or was it a cabinet? I think it must have been a cabinet committee. So under that was the Industrial Intelligence Centre, which is obviously an intelligence body, and it was to gather intelligence on industrial activity to give a clue as to the real size of German forces and industrial activity related to war, especially, right? Because it's the Committee for Imperial Defence, right? That IIC, the Intelligence Centre, was run by Desmond Morton. He was someone who we already know was privately supplying false air figures to Winston Churchill. So the main body for determining the state body for determining the reality of the German threat, so-called, was itself run by a guy who was just secretly and illegally supplying secret information to Churchill anyway. So the state itself, we can't separate really these private bodies like the Focus from the state. And obviously, as we know, Rex Leeper, a civil servant, had instigated Churchill joining the Focus. Like it's just all working together. The deep state merged with, I don't know what you call this, the war party, the anti-German war party. David Irving says, quote, when the Air Staff issued a secret memorandum on November the 5th, 1935, based, we now know, on its authentic code-breaking sources, stating firmly that the German front line consisted of only 594 planes at that time, not the 4,000 that Churchill said. Churchill sent an exasperated letter to the CID saying, it is to be hoped that this figure will not be made public, as it would certainly give rise to misunderstanding and challenge. Not saying that it's false. Just so use, in the same way as misinformation is used, the word misinformation is used now, right? Or malinformation. It's like, we're not saying it's untrue. We're saying you shouldn't say it. In the same way that Robert Whaley-Cohen seems to have regarded German propaganda. We're not saying it's untrue. We're not disputing it. We're saying that they're bastards for saying it. Or just that they're bastards. So I'm coming towards the end, right? And afterwards there'll be room for a few questions. Like, if anybody wants to ask questions, I hope I can see all your comments. I can only really see comments on YouTube, I'm afraid. I'm not. I can see this on Twitter as well, but I can't see if anyone's watching on Substack. I'm sorry, I can't see your questions, but you could put them on YouTube. So there was a lot of these figures were collaborating with the Soviets. I know I've said that already, but I think it's important to emphasize because the Soviet Union was a real threat to the whole world, right? I mean, I know that their forces were terribly, terribly smashed by the initial German invasion in 1941, but that's a long way after. And a lot of different vicissitudes of history led to that. There was no excuse for collaborating with the Soviets in any way. As I say, they had targeted the British Empire for subversion and destruction since the dawn of their regime. I say in one of my essays, Maurice Cowling, the historian, says that Robert van Sittert, quote, advocated a Russian alliance with France, British cooperation with Litvinov, Maxim Litvinov, that is the Soviet foreign minister, and tripartite firmness towards Germany. He, quote, treated the Franco-Soviet alliance as non-negotiable. How early van Sittert had that view, I'm not sure, but van Sittert was already scheming with the Soviet ambassador in London, Ivan Maisky, at least as early as 1935, again, long before anything that proved the German threat. That was all in their heads at the time. But he already saw fit to introduce Churchill to Maisky to bring about this alliance with the Soviets and France, and to, ideally everyone, Poland, Czechoslovakia, to surround Germany and to force them to submit to basically what was called Jewish foreign policy. Obviously, van Sittert wouldn't have seen that, but the policy of bringing down anyone who was a threat to Jews. And yeah, it was at Van Tittert's home, Robert Van Tittert's first at his own home in June 1935 that Winston Churchill first met Ivan Maysky, the Soviet ambassador. If you ever want to read more about that, read the Maysky Diaries, edited by Gabriel Gorodetsky. So just to emphasize how much collaboration there was with all of these forces and the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Robert Van Tittert was already in the habit of having private meetings with the head of the Board of Deputies. So, Van Tittert, I think, could not have gone to focus meetings, but in every way he was working with them and working to the same purpose. So I count him as part of the same front, the war party, right? The anti-German front, the pro-Soviet front. I say in one of my essays, in July 1936, a deputation from the board, including Neville Lasky, the president, and the vice president, Robert Whaley Cohen, you see how this all ties together, expressed sympathy for Jewish violence against the British Union of Fascists and prevailed on John Simon, the Home Secretary, to punish, quote, those preaching hatred. John Simon, by the way, David Irving says, was also a beneficiary of Henry Strakosch. Henry Strakosch left him something like £10,000 in his will. Interesting, right? I don't know if there's a connection there, but Simon's Act, passed in December that year, that's a couple of months. That's later in the same year as Cable Street, the massive assault on police by a large mob at Cable Street. It was a few months before this act passed by John Simon as Home Secretary. That act was, quote, influenced by the personal intervention of Harold Lasky, who was Neville Lasky's brother and openly pro-Soviet. And, quote, it made the police act with even greater intensity against the British Union fascists. So the BUF, I don't support fascism myself. I don't really... I know a lot of nationalists do, but I don't go along with that. Nevertheless, the BUF were firstly, they hadn't done anything to deserve being assaulted at their meetings and their demos and their marches. They largely became or developed their own paramilitary wing because they were assaulted. Just the same story as in Italy with Mussolini, same story in Germany, same everywhere. What is called the fash and the thugs and the stormtroopers and the boot boys, they exist because otherwise terrorists of communist and Jewish background, often the same people, will assault them and will try and stop them operating entirely. And the British Union Fascists, to their immense credit, are the only organisation that I know of, I can't think of any other, I mean, prove me wrong, the only organisation that was strongly and vocally, like very explicitly, against war with Germany. There's the Olympia rally, I think, was it 1938 or 39? A huge rally, I think it was at Olympia or Earl's Court. Impressive propaganda. There's impressive pictures from it and stuff, and a big speech by Oswald Mosley. Much as I don't support fascism, I support that because it was all about let's not go to war with Germany. I don't think it wanted war with the Soviets or anything like that. It's not like pro-war in any way. It's genuinely for keeping peace. It's like, this is going to destroy us. We go to war with Germany. Apart from all it's just wrong anyway. It just doesn't make any sense. It's also just going to destroy us, destroy the empire, destroy the country. Tying in with this as well, right? In 1934, simply to stop him supporting the British Union of Fascists, Lord Rothermere, the owner of the Daily Mail, was also, by the way, part owner of the Daily Express. He was actually friends with Lord Beaverbrook and business partner. But yeah, the owner of the Daily Mail, he had for a couple of months supported the BUF, like 3 cheers for Mosley or whatever it was. The Daily Mail, being one of the biggest papers in the world, was pro-BUF, right? After a couple of months of that, he was threatened by an advertising boycott. I think Unilever was Unilever. They are a major advertiser. They own loads of consumer products. Look on the back of like all the sort of food and packaged food and shops sold pharmaceuticals and toiletries and stuff and toothpaste and whatever. Loads of them are sold by Unilever. They're the sort of the British version of Procter and Gamble, you could say. But it's mainly, I think most of the directors were Jewish. Certainly several of the directors were able to get Unilever to threaten Rothermere with an advertising boycott. I think they did start a boycott, and he just immediately folded. He just, his business was selling adverts, obviously. He just could not afford to lose all these people. Any company that relies on selling adverts is just, their neck is in the hands of anyone who wants to and can put together an advertising boycott. And obviously, who do we see doing this now? The Anti-Defamation League, right? Stop Funding Hate, the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, and so on. It's just a normal tactic now. Although, thankfully, since Elon Musk bought X, it's not worked so well. But yeah, it's a noose around the neck of loads of media, right? And yeah, if Lord Rothermere, who was obviously very rich, was already a lord, was the owner of the paper, if he could just be forced to stop supporting the BUF, anyone could, right? So there's that. Just read that across the whole British media. Anyone who stood out against the Focus's agenda had probably already been silenced before the Focus came into effect, let alone after. So it's just a unanimous, at least blanket acceptance of their agenda, if not like active involvement in it. You just could not stand up against them already by the mid-30s. I write in one of my other essays, the board of deputies had begun to co-opt anti-fascist militancy before the assault in Aldgate, which was they called the Battle of Cable Street. Quote, establishing a body to direct defence policy in mid-1936, which was called the Coordinating Committee, or the COC, or later known as the Jewish Defence Committee. And later in 1936, after that was formed, Sidney Salomon, the secretary, in an interview with the Evening Standard, absolved his thugs of blame for their aggression, arguing that it was, quote, not human nature to stand calmly by while black shirts shout insults. So if they just shout an insult, or even if you just say that they shout an insult, you have carte blanche to assault them. Simple as that. Just claiming for himself the right to terrorism. Herbert Morrison, the leader of the London County Council and a senior figure in the Labour Party, and later he would become the Home Secretary under Churchill, because it was a national government, incorporated all three big parties, which and the Labour Party obviously affected to exist for the benefit of British workers. That was a joke. Herbert Morrison met in secret with Neville Lasky and also Harry Pollitt, the leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, in October of 1936. Was that just after Cable Street, I think? To coordinate, or was that just before Cable Street? Anyway, around the same time, to coordinate the terrorism they mutually supported. This is my words. By March 1937, Neville Lasky was satisfied that condoning violence would not lose him any support from politicians, because he had been more cautious before. Quote, in contact with the Home Office to discuss anti-Jewish meetings, Lasky warned that any self-respecting Jew, this is his words, any self-respecting Jew in the crowd would have the greatest difficulty in restraining himself, not only vocally, but even physically. So just a Jew just walking past, seeing a BUF demonstration anywhere, implicitly there has the right to just launch into them, or get a mob together and just go attack them. So the official, the position of like the official Jewish community, like the Board of Deputies and its sub-organisations, was, we just claim the right to assault you. If we don't like what you're saying, we claim the right to just go in and start headbutting people, weapons, whatever, anything. And obviously inciting others to do it. Like at the Battle of Cable Street, it was a lot of Jews and also a lot of apparently Irish, a lot of people who just recruited by, like Antifa things now, like they just recruit commies and social democrats and so on, socialists from all around the country, and bust them in just to create a violent mob. This was led and endorsed by the Board of Deputies. What a venerable, respectable institution. Neville Lasky also urged police to collaborate with Jewish and communist infiltrators or invaders to start fights at BUF meetings. So there's some famous footage of this, of BUF toughs, of BUF thugs, like rudely ejecting people from their meetings. Obviously, what the coverage never says is that was BUF's own meetings. They've got the right to exclude people from it. Obviously, people don't have the right to go in, climb up onto the gantries, which some people did, and like just start screaming their heads off to disrupt the meeting. But Neville Lesky, the president of the Board of Deputies, was urging police to collaborate with those infiltrators to break up the meetings, to make it impossible for the BUF to operate. And they knew that they could do this. They knew that this tactic would work, because the newsreel producers, this was one of the main sources of news at the time for most people, newsreels at the cinema, right? Newsreel producers already routinely used, edited footage of these fights to portray the BUF as the instigators of the violence. It's nonsense. It's ridiculous. Obviously, it's a BUF meeting. How could they be? But cutting things in a certain way does seem to work, and a certain voiceover. And I would just point out that most newsreels at the time were produced by companies owned by Lawrence Ostra, another Jewish immigrant in Britain, who I think he also owned like Odeon Cinemas, or his cousin did. But yeah, he's a big figure in the media, including, I think he owned like Gaumont, the Gaumont company, or Gaumont label, or Movie Tone. It's one of these, but newsreel producers. Anyway, Lawrence Ostra. So everything's working together to just demonize anyone who's against regime change in Germany. Oh, and those newsreels were also shown on the BBC. The BBC television had started by 1936. It was then stopped when the war started, and started again after the war. But yeah, some people were watching BBC television by this point. Oh, and the BBC, their own news operation was young at the time, so they were inclined to use newsreel producers, especially Lawrence Ostra's ones, which were strongly allied with the Board of Deputies, basically. I just remarked in one of my essays, most historians are sort of militantly incurious about how the Board of Deputies, which represented less than 1% of the population of Britain, came to have such influence. I don't have any answers to that myself. I just think it's important to note that most historians choose to overlook that. Like, how come Neville Lesky just got meetings with senior ministers? He represented at most, but not even this, but at most 400,000 people out of a population of, or 300, no, not even 400,000. But anyway, less than 1% of the population. And yet he's listened to as though he's like more important than the whole British population. So coming to the end, right, I just want to emphasize that, and I'm skipping over the next few years, because mostly what I've talked about here is 1933 up to 1936, with occasional mentions of later stuff. But just fast forwarding to when Churchill became Prime Minister, right? So obviously, Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, September 1939. Then there was 8 months of war, including the Dunkirk evacuation. And there was the failed attack on German forces in Norway, the failed Norway campaign, which was largely instigated by Churchill, by the way, but blamed on Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain stepped down and just could not maintain enough support. Chamberlain stepped down in, May 1940, and Churchill became Prime Minister. I can't remember, was he, I guess just by acclamation of the cabinet, just enough of the cabinet said that it's got to be him. I think that's how it worked. Churchill, I would say at that moment, there began not just a new government, not just a new prime ministership, not just a new cabinet, not just a new government, but I would say a new regime. I think that was the moment at which regime change occurred in Britain. Obviously, as I said, it was for the main aim of it was to force Britain to adopt an anti-German foreign policy. Churchill referred to his gang, the Focus, as the Cave of Adullam. He used that phrase several years before the war, I think. And it's very astute. Or the Adullamites. It refers to the book of Samuel, I think, or one of the books of the Old Testament. And it refers to basically a government in exile, or a government in waiting. It can have other uses, but that's what he meant by it, right? He meant we are out in the cave. We're out of the action, planning how to get back in. Like, we've been wrongly excluded from power. We've been overlooked. We've been marginalised. Chamberlain, has all the power. Baldwin and Chamberlain have all the power, and they're using it wrong. We know what's what. We know what's right. We have the clear vision, the foresight. This is how Churchill's always talked about in post-war history. He's like the great seer of the future. Like he could somehow, in 1933, he could just see the next 12 years. It's absurd. We just stop and think about it for a moment. It's absurd, right? But anyway, but he did have some foresight. He did, like, in a way, he did. Like he saw that he could get into government if he pursued a certain line, and that's what he did, right? And these guys, the Focus, they were his vehicle for doing it. And so the Cave of Adullam, he saw himself as a usurper. He saw himself as like waiting for his chance to overthrow who the people have elected, if the people can be said to have elected anyone, right? And it was like, no, we need to take over. The arrogance of it, the audacity. But that was him. He did not care about what the people wanted at all. And I'll just emphasize that the membership of the Focus, as early as 36, it included the next Prime Minister, Churchill himself, his Deputy Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who also became Prime Minister straight after, and three, including those two, three of the four Prime Ministers who cemented the post-war consensus and obviously established anti-fascism and collaborating with the left as the norm, right? Over the sort of Harold Macmillan was the last one. He lost power. He stepped down in, I think, 1961 or 62. So 22 years under those four prime ministers, Churchill, Attlee, Eden, Macmillan. They cemented, obviously, the post-war consensus in the sense of social democracy or like the welfare state, the mixed economy, but also in the sense of anti-fascism as the core belief of the establishment. The idea that you can abide commies. You can suffer them to exist. Obviously, the Cold War complicates that, right? But you can abide commies, including in Britain, including in the universities, including in the intelligence services, although that wasn't supposed to happen, but openly on TV, on the BBC, on the radio, you can collaborate with them to overthrow your own conservative government. What you can never do is even let any fascist exist, any fascist regime that can't be suffered to exist. That's what I mean by anti-fascism, right? This extremely slanted left-wing view, but that's adopted by supposed figures of the right, like Churchill, like Eden, like Macmillan. They're all actually really leftists. All three of those guys had all given up on what is called capitalism, and they certainly gave up on just loyalty to their own country. They're traitors. They would never accept that. These are all men who fought in combat. I feel rather uneasy calling these people who'd fought in the trenches and stuff. I feel very uneasy calling them traitors. But I also don't think it can be avoided. And I think all three of these men as well, and Attlee, but yeah, all three of these, Eden, Macmillan, and Churchill, they all also became supporters of the European unification idea. What led to the EC and the EU. So yeah, just one more component of the new regime. Brendan Bracken, just to single out one other member of the Focus, he became the head of the new Ministry of Information, i.e. the propaganda. That he became the Goebbels of Churchill. Churchill's Goebbels, which never existed before. Britain didn't have a Ministry of Propaganda until then. And it's not just propaganda. It's not just putting out propaganda. It's information control as well, right? It's censorship. It's pressuring, threatening maybe the newspaper. I mean, the Ministry of Information during the war, had really what we would call like dictatorial powers, authoritarian. It's very authoritarian. It's wartime censorship is unabashed, like just total censorship. Anything can be said to help the enemy. So yeah. So my concluding line is that the Focus is not just some like a Jewish money vehicle. It's not just a vehicle for resentment or anything. It became. It's not just. I don't know. It's not just an airy fairy thing. It's not just like a shadow that we should sort of mention and nod to, but just sort of forget about that. It's not really the main story. No, it should be the subject of whole books and documentaries, and it's a sin that it's not. That it's only in Irving and a few other books in very scattered, just a couple of pages here and there. The Focus, the Anti-Nazi Council, became the new regime in 1940. And what they did has not been undone, has not been gone against. All political leaders, all leading politicians since 1940 have agreed with them on their program. which is we are basically leftists. We collaborate with the left, even if we're not. So ever since then, we've had I've said this in previous works that I've done, but ever since then, we've had a real left wing, which does get some of what it wants, although not the full socialist left. And we've had a fake right wing, and that is the story of the world since 1940. So that is what I prepared myself to say, and just realised I've been talking for nearly 3 hours, 2.5 hours or so. So by all means, drop a few questions in now, but if there aren't any, feel free to put questions under the video or on Substack. I will post this on Substack as a video anyway. And I just, it's lovely that you listen. It's lovelier still, though, if you ask me something, because then I do feel like it's kind of come across. Do you know what I mean? So, but if there aren't any questions now, no problem. You can send them to me. I see that in the Twitter chat, by the way, or the X chat, by the way, Olaf has very helpfully linked to Eugen Speer's book on the focus, which is, oh, well, yeah, sorry, I did mention it. Yes, Olaf, but thank you very much for posting that. I can't really link that. Well, I'll share that on Twitter afterwards. But yeah, just while I wait for any questions to come in, I would just say, like, I have been researching this reading anything I can find about it for the last sort of 2 years. I mean, I think I've read everything there is. But if anyone knows of any other sources that I didn't mention, by all means, tweet at me or whatever if you come across them. There's a few comments about Dawn Brandon asked, what did I have for dinner? I haven't had dinner yet, Dawn. I that's why I'm kind of ready to finish this. I'm gonna have a big steak. It's in the fridge. There's a few comments about Unilever. Toffee, hello Toffee, by the way, good to see you. Says that Unilever, yeah, they pretty much own everything. Flash, Domestos, Fairy Liquid, Persil. I think they own like Aquafresh and stuff. Yeah, they're sort of like the brand company. They own loads of the famous brands. Dawn Brandon says, I remember Unilever buying up several small manufacturers in England. Yeah, Unilever, just a reminder, they are they had the power to threaten Lord Rothermere with a boycott and get their way. Toffee says, so not only do they run the film industry, they run the cinemas themselves as well. Yeah, you might want to, if you're interested. I mean, I could do another talk on this, but I did a talk on this is the thing, right? Okay, so I've only covered the focus here. I've only actually covered the focus up to about 1937 or 8. So this all derives from my essay, The Champions of Judea, but I've done 2 others which are supposed to complete the picture. I just could not fit it all in one. I mean, I could have done like a book-length essay, I suppose. Maybe I will put it out as a book, but there's 2 essays that follow that. Champions of Judea is the first one that proves that the focus existed and so on. But then the next one, the Litvinov School, mentions them. And then the one after that, A Conflict of Philosophies, that goes into them a lot again, right? What I call the focus press. I really recommend people read that, or if you want me to do a video on it, I can. But yeah, like the extent of media control by the war party, not all specifically under the focus, but the same program, the same front. It was amazing. Yeah, and it does include like the cinemas. It does include most of the news. Yeah, so Eversource says, why did you choose this topic for your first video, given that you got banned? Well, yeah, I mean, I could just get banned off YouTube again at any point. I mean, they could. I don't know. It's a slightly different regime from 5 years ago. As I say, the Churchill speech that I'm partly the David Irving speech that I'm referring to here, referred to at the start of this, that has been on YouTube for 4 years, and it's called Churchill and the Jews. So I don't know. That's allowed. That's all right. So maybe this is all right, but it might not be. It might get banned again. But now that you do have the option of X as well, Twitter or an X, and you do have Substack. By the way, if people who are not familiar with Substack, please just go check it out. My Substack is eternalhorus.substack.com. And that is where I've been putting out a bit of material for the last 2 years. And you might find it interesting. That's the most I can do. I can't make proper videos anymore, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. It's way too much work, and yeah, you just run the risk of getting banned. Like, so I got banned in March 2020, April 2020 maybe, and then I was just on Odyssey. But on Odyssey, there's no growth. The only people who watch you on Odyssey are basically already people who have heard of me from elsewhere. You just cannot. You can't get, I mean, you can post Odyssey stuff on Telegram, but you can't get people to watch it. It's like, what the hell's Odyssey? You know? Rumble's a bigger one, but even that's still really small. I don't know. I just, for the amount of effort, like of editing, closely editing the video, finding images and so on, that's not me. That's not for me. It's not worth it. It's not worth the amount of views you get or anything. So, but sorry, why do this? I just, okay, sorry. Yeah, I should have said that at the start, Eversaw. I should have said, why this topic? Because I don't know anyone who's done quite what I'm doing here. I've tried to bring it all together. Everything there is to know about the focus, I've tried to bring it all together. Like Irving couldn't do that back in the 80s, obviously. A lot of this stuff was written since. But I wanted to do I wanted to cover the whole thing, at least the first couple of years of it. The focus, right? Nobody else, as I say, there is a book on it by the guy Eugen Speer, who set it up. But even that only tells you part of the story. I just think it has to be situated. It has to be situated amid the deep state thing as well. I don't know. I think if you look back, if you listen to all this again, it kind of makes sense how it all links up. But I'll tell you one thing about the way that I write essays as well. They're not necessarily that clear. Like what my essays are sort of, I try to write elegantly and stuff, but what I'm trying to do kind of cuts across that, because I'm just trying to pack in the most information, relevant information, and it all has to be sourced, right? So I won't include anything that I can't prove, because people will dispute it. And I don't believe in speculation in place of fact anyway. And I sacrifice written, like normal writing conventions, right? So what I write in my essays is actually often really backloaded. Like the main point is right near the end and stuff like that. So I would never make it in the mainstream media. But I don't know of anybody who has brought together all the information available up to this point. Some of these papers I'm quoting are only from a few years ago. I don't know of anybody who's put it all together in one place. So here it is, right? I hope this is helpful. And I know that some people won't read as well, but they will listen. So, they won't read an article, especially 10,000 words, but they will listen to something even if it's long, because they can do other stuff while they're listening. Anyway, can he see the YouTube chat? I can, yes. Deeper than the deepest law. Well done, mate. Thank you. Yeah, if anyone likes me, I guess, and isn't aware, I'm on the Deepest Law on most Wednesdays on Academic Agents channel. So we'll be doing one tomorrow, I believe. That's usually at midday on Wednesdays. Check us out. We have been for the last year or so reviewing Adam Curtis's documentaries. A leftist, but an interesting one. So thank you, Jacob. Great video, you say. Thank you. I appreciate that. Anyone's welcome to, you'll see in the description box under this video, there are, there's options to show your support in other ways. I should have linked to all my other stuff, but anyway. Boxtosis says, I know it's a big question, but what would be your objection to the fascism of the time, or in general, if you could summarize it in a nutshell? Well, just, as someone's replied, Eversaw has replied, I am for private property and free market. I mean, I'm for the free market because private property implies that. As in, if you're allowed to own your own stuff, that's what you have. You have a free market. That's kind of what it means. Anything state-directed or state-led or state-organized begins to go against private property, and the more of it you have, the less private property you have, the less your property rights really exist or apply. I don't object to fascism when fascists are trying to stop wars, obviously, and trying to save civilization, basically. Strongly support that, as I said about the the Olympia rally and stuff. Like, well done to them. I mean, Mosley was a hero for that. But I'm in favour of private property. So, to the extent that fascism, and it's really not clear, people mean a lot of different things by it, but to the extent that fascism implies a state-led economy, a Keynesian or more socialist economy, I mean, more socialist than Keynesian, I'm against that. I'm against any kind of state socialism. People want to create their own private socialist communities. That's nothing to do with me, but Jacob Herwig asks, do you have a Ko-Fi for donations and subscriptions? Sorry, but I was using Ko-Fi for a while, Ko-fi, coffee, whatever it is. But it was unclear whether using them exposed your name and bank account and address and stuff. It was just... So I'm sorry to be awkward, but there is a donation link. It's the same. It works the same as Ko-fi anyway. Ko-fi is just Ko-fi uses Stripe. I'm using, this is just Stripe. There's a Stripe link under the video. So feel free, and I really appreciate it if anyone does donate. It really helps. And yeah, the J-Trix has been in full effect. I've never heard that one before. Foundations of Writing. Buy it now. That's not my course though. AA sells courses if you want to do a course. This was a really good illustration of elite theory as well. Did I forget to mention any elites? JD says, I'll give you a hug if I ever see you, mate. Okay, if I agree. Thanks for the answer. No, it's nice. But thanks for the answer. You won't force it on me, though, will you? Thanks for the answer. On the focus, would you say that if they'd never organised so well, Britain might have stayed out of the war? Yes, I absolutely do. Sorry, I should have emphasised that. Yes. I should have said that. Should have emphasised that very clearly. I believe that these people were among the main causes of the war. Had it not been, in fact, they were essential. I made a video that was probably, I think, the one that this channel got banned for before, but it was called The Judean-German War. Maybe I'll get banned again just for mentioning it. But that did make the case. I did say it clearly in that without this influence, no, the forces of peace would not have been overthrown. And that was what was required. You actually had to kill the peace force, the peace party, i.e. Chamberlain, led by Chamberlain. You actually had to kill it off. You had to defeat it. Without these guys above all, that would not have been achieved, and Chamberlain would have had his way, which would have been, well, he wouldn't have been pressured into the guarantee to Poland in the first place, and he definitely wouldn't have declared war. I mean, even with the full alliance, because Chamberlain made a pact under great pressure and probably regretted it afterwards. But he made a defensive guarantee to Poland in March of 1939, just a guarantee of and it was supposed to be really conditional. It was actually not intended to threaten Hitler at all. But then in the last days before declaring war on Germany, and before Germany obviously invaded Poland, Britain did convert that to a full alliance. Britain and Poland became full allies, including like a Polish pledge to protect Britain from a German invasion. And even then, after Germany did invade Poland, Chamberlain still tried to avoid actually acting on that alliance. So his heart was not in it. But he was surrounded and harassed and just cornered, especially by the cabinet by that point. A lot of them had just gone over to the war view. And so, yeah, without the influence of the focus, I mean, Churchill himself did a great deal of damage, but all of this stuff, I would emphasize at this point, the range of media interests on their side. Like, it was enough to make it seem like pro-war, well, anti-Hitler was the consensus view, which in fact, I'm sure it wasn't. But amongst these guys, it's what the left do. It's what a lot of, like, I think Jewish forces do. They make themselves seem like the center ground and the consensus. I mean, Roy Jenkins said in that long quote that I read out, he said, Churchill was moving towards the centre of British politics. Now, what do we mean? What, a massive rearmament and breaking the finances, like spending way more than you can afford. That's the centre ground. Threatening Germany while supporting, basically condoning what the Soviets did. That's the centre ground, is it? But in a way it was. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't. It's mad to call that the centre ground, but they made themselves appear to be the centre ground. Was the Eversource says, was the BUF the only counter elite which opposed the war, you reckon? It's the only one I've heard of. If anyone knows of any others, tell me. The thing is, one slight complication is that a lot of the leftists who were involved in the focus weren't even for rearmament, and they weren't really for war. I don't know what the hell they thought they could achieve, but they were against rearmament because a lot of them were sort of pacifists. Obviously, once the war started, it's a whole different story. Everyone gets on board, right? But a lot of people like Clement Attlee, I don't think they were aiming for war with Germany. They thought that they could sufficiently discredit Hitler or surround Hitler with so many hostile states that he just would never think of declaring war. I really do think a lot of people did not envision war coming about. But Churchill and Boothby and scoundrel figures, they were. So it's a really complicated figure. But yeah, basically, the BUF were the only organisation I've heard of who clearly spoke out against war, and they could see it coming, some years before, and they were against it. M says, do you also disavow the ethno-narcissist like AA does? I'll have to watch that video. I had it on earlier, but I was doing something else. I'll listen to it again. I'm not sure. Eversource says, perhaps you could do a partner stream where you discuss who the Focus were smashing in the period you just discussed. What do you mean? Who they were smashing? I mean, Neville Chamberlain above all. I'm not sure what else you mean by that. Toffee says, it's great you're back on YouTube, Horace. Cheers. Cheers for having me on your stream as well, Toffee. I'll be happy to come on again. And I hope you make this a regular thing. This stream's been absolutely boss. It's good Merseyside vernacular there. And the lightning strike. I really appreciate that. I don't know about regular, but yeah, I'll try and do more. Yeah, I suffered some financial setbacks in my life. I can't make this my main thing unless people start donating a sort of salary amount of money monthly. Then it would be a different picture. But I need to spend most of my time on making money. So I have to do this around that. But I will do them as often as I can, and I hope people have enjoyed this. And I'm going to make this the last one on YouTube. Boxtosis says, utterly galling to think what this devious arrogance brought upon us. Cheers for the stream. Hope you can make a book out of this and other essays on your Substack. Really good stuff. Thank you, Boxtosis. And I just appreciate everyone who, ever since I started making videos on any of these matters in 2019, people have been remarkably nice to me. I like that. And, I wouldn't have carried on. It is that reception, knowing that people really respect what you've done. It's warming, it's encouraging, and people have shown me just a huge amount of appreciation. So I appreciate that. So let's just have a last look. What we got? Olaf linked Eugen Spear's book. So if anyone wants to see that, Dimitri certain name says, only gone and missed the whole thing. Rewatchable? Yeah, I'll download this and I'll put it on my Substack. So my Substack link is in my Twitter profile. So it will be rewatchable. I don't know about immediate. Oh yeah, it should be on YouTube. Yeah, it'll be on YouTube. Unless I've done something wrong, it'll be on YouTube. Dissonant Life says, are you going to? Oh yeah, same question. Are you going to disavow the ethno-narcissist with AA? I'm not sure. I'll have to watch that video again. And on Substack, I don't know if people have been watching this on Substack. I hope I'm broadcasting to Substack. But if you've asked questions, I'm really sorry. I'm new to streaming to 3 platforms. So I actually can't see my own stream on Substack. But if you've put in questions, please just send them to me. You should be able to message me privately on there, I think. Or put I'll post this as a post on Substack. So you'll be able to put your questions there. Or just post them under the YouTube video. Or tweet me. Tweeting me is probably the least good option. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching. I don't know how many people have watched. We've got 50 watching now. I don't know, but it's just great having anyone watching anyway. So thank you, and thank you, Ren Cobb, as well. But yeah, just thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it's useful. I hope it's interesting. Oh, and the other thing, if you don't want to donate or anything, obviously I love donations, but just send it to people who haven't heard of this stuff or who are interested in the causes of the Second World War. Causes of the First World War continues to be a major controversy among academics, whereas the causes of the Second World War are often treated as settled. Hitler appeared, therefore the war. But I think those 6 intervening years are quite important, and not just because of the reoccupation of the Rhineland and the Night of Broken Glass. So on that note, thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you for another one sometime soon. All right, cheers everyone.